They say myths are just stories, fragments of imagination from people who didn't yet understand the world. But what if every flood, every god and every creation myth we have ever told was not fiction, but memory? Across every ancient culture, from the Sumerians of Mesopotamia to the priests of Egypt and the astronomers of the Maya, the same story appears again and again. A world destroyed by fire and flood. Survivors emerging from the mountains or the sea. Bearded gods teaching humanity how to write, how to farm, how to count the stars. Different continents, different languages, but the same script. Now imagine this. Around 12,800 years ago, something real happened. A sudden global cataclysm that geologists now call the Younger Dryas impact. Layers of black sediment found on every continent mark a single moment when the world burned, then froze, almost overnight. And right after that, civilization appears. Agriculture, monumental architecture, calendars, writing, all in rapid succession, as if someone had simply reopened an ancient file. Göbekli Tepe rises in Turkey, the world's first known temple, built with impossible precision by supposed hunter-gatherers. Off the coast of India, sonar scans reveal entire cities buried under 100 feet of water. And on every ancient monument, the same symbols appear. Eyes, serpents, wings, suns. As if the builders were leaving behind a universal signature. We were here before. So the question isn't whether myths are true or false. The question is whether they're records. Encrypted testimonies from a civilization so old it slipped beyond the reach of written history. And if that's the case, what else have we mistaken for legend? But first, before we begin, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. And with that said, let's step inside tonight's story. Fluorescent lights hum like tired bees over glass cases. Security cameras blink a slow red. A mechanical heartbeat in the empty halls. Your footsteps echo off cool marble as you drift past statues that stare without eyes. A lone researcher stands at a Mesopotamian case, one sleeve pushed up, fingertip tracing a shallow groove in clay. The cuneiform wedge marks are tiny ramps of shadow, still sharp after thousands of years. The air smells faintly of dust and varnish. The building's heaters click on, then settle. Somewhere a door sighs back into place. She leans closer, breath fogging the glass. Her finger lifts, then falls into the pattern again, like a needle finding the groove. The thought arrives quiet, the way a strange word sometimes lands and waits. What if these stories never asked for belief at all? What if they were statements, sworn like testimony in a court that forgot its judge? A flood so high the mountain goats needed new paths, fire that fell in sheets from a torn sky, a stranger who walks out of the surf with a bundle of measures and the patience to teach a battered village how to count the year again. Not parable, not entertainment, a record. The cases whisper back in their own languages. Sumerian tablets speak of waters that do not stop. Egyptian walls show boats gliding above fields, gods holding the loop and staff as if they are tools as much as symbols. Maya codices carry storm glyphs and the calm face of a serpent that holds time in its coils. Spread across oceans, cut by different hands, the plot keeps repeating. Fire from the heavens, waters that climb instead of flow. Children led up slopes by elders who watch the horizon for a dawn that stays away too long. Then figures coming from the margins in the quiet after, the ones who know how to write seasons into stone. The researcher unlocks a flat file and draws out a wide drawer labelled in neat handwriting, mythic parallels, paper rustles, images fan across the desk, seals, steely, painted bark, a spiral cut into basalt, a staff wrapped by twin serpents, not as a medical sign but as a path, an arc with decks stacked like the ribs of a whale, a man with a fish's body teaching from the shore. Each photo slides under the next like evidence in a cold case, not dramatic proof, but the kind of repetition that makes the mind pause. The fluorescent buzz falls away until you can hear the scratch of her pencil in the margin, a date, a note, a small arrow. Across the scattered sheets, details repeat with unnerving precision. 7 days when no sun rose and fires burned with a choked brown flame. A mountain with a specific name, marked not only in one tongue but echoing in another, half a world away. After the waters recede, the same gifts arrive like a starter kit for a broken village. A way to mark months with scratches on bone. Grain lines drawn in tidy bundles. A rule about when to plant, when to keep tools dry, when to fast so stores last. Some whisper that these are not coincidences but aligned fragments from the same event viewed through many windows. At a conference room 2 floors up, bright slides flip past. Coffee cups line up like a small wall. Voices are soft but firm. Universal archetypes, says one. Parallel invention, says another. Critics dismiss any talk of direct memory as romantic blending. Floods are common, storms are common, mountains are common. We love heroes. We love instructive endings. The slides glow with charts and tidy arrows. The arguments feel safe, like a warm hall when the wind is up. Downstairs, the researcher turns a photo sideways and frowns. The carpet muffles her weight as she shifts, as if the building wants to keep the thought from echoing too loudly. In a Highland home far from climate control, a child sits by the hearth. An elder pulls a stick through the ash and traces the bright points they've watched for seasons. He draws a long arc, a slow drift, a circle on the circle that means the year bends back. He says, in a voice the child has heard in both lullaby and warning, "Once, the sky fell." The words are simple. The story is longer. The child's palm learns the shape of the wave by copying it, and then the shape of the hill where they ran, and the notch where the sun should return. The same phrase turns up on a tablet in a museum drawer. The same idea hides in the name of a mountain in a coastal story told before bed. The drawer yields one more fold-out sheet, a chart, columns of dates, dots marking layers, a line dipping sharp at a point that sits about 12,800 years back. Greenland's ice tells it like a pulse suddenly stilled, as if temperature walked off a cliff. The researcher unfolds a smaller clipping. Black soil found in a thin band across continents, a line of soot and tiny diamonds born in heat that rock alone does not make. Supporters suggest this is the geological shadow of a night the world changed. Others dismiss it as misplaced markers and messy dating. The numbers sit on the page with the calm of math, neither eager nor shy. She moves the ice core graph under a photo of wall carvings, where a snake's body, the time serpent, wraps a field of animals. In the margin, someone has written a note about 7. 7 nights without dawn. 7 steps up to a refuge cut into the rock. 7 seed types saved in a dry jar in a cave above the floodline. It's a neat number. It's also everywhere. The pencil taps 3 times, a small metronome keeping time with nothing but the mind's own music. The conference above breaks for lunch. Chairs scrape. The projector cools with a fan's quick whir. Down here, the glass reflects a face that looks young in one pane and tired in the next. The cabinets breathe their varnish smell. The building has its own weather. Art wings hold their chills. Stone galleries stay 1 degree colder than the rooms with wool or wood. The researcher lifts a small tablet with a catalogue tag and holds it in both hands like a book, not to read it, to feel the weight of the claim it makes. Across the scattered world, floods recur in tales you'd expect to diverge. Hindu lore speaks of a man who survives with a warning and a plan. Greek stories hold a couple tossing seeds of stone into empty streets. In Mesopotamia, a boat that is not quite a boat rides out a sky that falls apart. In later texts, a family counts animals by kind. Different flavour, same plot beats. Critics counter that all this proves is that water scares us and we live near rivers. It's a good point, It just doesn't close the file. Some stories place their refuge with surprising care. A named peak, a direction of travel, a length of darkness that aligns with days described a continent away. Not all the details agree. They never do, but the scatter is tight enough to trace a shape. Not a tidy circle, more a constellation. You can draw your own lines, but the same stars keep showing up in the same patch of sky. Her fingertip returns to the clay and follows the groove that a hand made in a time with no museums or slides. The mark is both a word and an impression left by a life. You can feel the tool's bite where it pushes past grit. You can feel the pause in a long stroke where the writer lifted to breathe, or flinched when someone dropped a jar in a room gone too quiet. The material holds more than meaning. It holds the hum of the moment when meaning was laid down. In the drawer's corner, an index card lists translations, some missed by a generation, some corrected by a young scholar who found a better match. Language shifts like sand, but a picture of a boat is still a boat. A mountain line is still a mountain line. A net of stars is still the sky. Symbols travel better than words. If memory is trying to cross a gulf of years, it likely chooses what can't be fully lost, shapes that mirror the world we still see when we look up. Flash the frame one more time to the upstairs room, where someone's slide shows a mountain, a flood, a boat, and arrows linking them to statues and seals. The speaker points with a laser and says the word archetype, safe category, clean shelf. A hand in the back, lifting slowly, asks whether it matters what we call it if the dates in the ice line up. The room buzzes with polite replies. No one looks unkind, no one has to. There's comfort in a shelf that holds everything without letting it spill. Below, the researcher's pencil stops. The wool sleeve leaves a faint smear on the desk where her arm rested. She looks at the photos arranged so that the same shape repeats across culture and time. Eye, coil, boat, tree, mountain. A grammar not taught but learned by living. If the same set of tools appears after the flood in stories across far shores, maybe the teachers carried more than tricks. They carried a kit that fits human hands in any century. In a coastal village, long before lasers and slides, a man with a fish's body, drawn that way to fix the memory, stands dripping on a beach and shows a row of children how many nights to wait before planting, how to set a stone so the equinox light splits its edge. You can feel the grain of the staff in his hand. You can hear the sound of waves against a hollow log canoe. He speaks a local tongue, badly but with care. He does not ask to be a god, he asks for patience. The children repeat the measures back until their voices match. You return to the ice cores. The line plunges 12,800 years ago like a trapdoor dropped, then climbs back slow. The soot bands darken the cores. The tiny diamonds shimmer under a microscope as if stars fell and froze into grit. Supporters suggest a comet or fragments of one lit the world edge to edge, then snuffed it cold. Critics dismiss it as misread layers or volcanic smoke dressed in comet clothes. Both positions fit in the same drawer for now. The fact remains, the clock inside the ice jerked at the same moment the stories say the heavens burned. If an earlier chapter existed and the page tore out, the margin notes we keep finding, the myths, might be the scrawl left in the binding. That thought doesn't prove a lost city under every bay. It does make the repeated gifts and the echoed numbers feel less like neat fiction and more like duct-taped memory, hauled across bad years by people who wanted their children to have a spring with good seeds and a calendar that still worked. The researcher flicks off her desk lamp and the room slips back to the museum's low glow. The glass cases become dark rivers. The cameras blink their patient red. In the quiet, the clay tablets look almost warm, like loaves cooling on a shelf. She rests her palm on the glass over one tablet, then withdraws it as if not to leave heat behind. The door shuts softly as she leaves. The hum returns. If myths store what the Earth once did to us, then the start of our timeline might be a second opening, not the first. In that case, the museum is not a hall of ancient stories. It's an evidence room for a crime whose victim survived and forgot the attacker's face. The question that shouldn't exist presses in. Are we living after a reboot, reading the crash report as bedtime tales? The lights click off row by row. Darkness moves like a slow tide through the halls. Upstairs, someone stacks chairs. Downstairs, the desk holds its scatter of images until morning. And in the gap between bright slides and dusty drawers, one more pattern waits for a night when the world changed so fast that memory had to become a boat. Snow falls into ash. You taste mineral on your tongue, the way campfire dust lingers after the last ember dies. Overhead, the night splits into streaks that don't move like stars. They move like nails dragged across glass. A hunter stands hip-deep in drifted soot, eyes on a river that hisses like a pot too close to the flame. Steam rises, then thins, and the surface goes from roiling to hard in a breath. The cold drops without warning. It feels like a trapdoor opening under your ribs. The reeds crackle, the air burns and bites at once. Far from that bank and thousands of years later, a core of ancient ice holds the echo of that instant. The data marks a sudden swing, warming giving way to sharp cold around 12,800 years ago. Charts show a cliff where a slope should be, a reversal rather than a drift. What had been a long thaw snaps back to near glacial. The dates line up, not as a vague season, but as a tight band. To those who read climate-entrapped bubbles and dust, the change is undeniable. The question is the how. Some whisper it began with the sky, a fragment or swarm that broke and burned, a shock that set forests alight and threw haze across hemispheres. Others dismiss the fireworks and point to water, the rerouting of melt as ice sheets collapsed, changing ocean belts like a hand turning a dial. The younger world was touchy. A new river course, a surge of fresh water, or a cluster of eruptions could have tipped it. The argument lives in sediments and silt, in which metals gather and which minerals glint under a microscope's light. On a floodplain, a small band of foragers presses into a hollow where willow roots bind the bank. Game trails that once ran noisy and sure look empty. The herds have moved north, or vanished. The old route between winter shelter and summer forage offers no guarantees. A father checks an old snare and finds only snow clotted in the loop. He stands with a strip of leather between his teeth, testing its strength. His child watches the sky like a mirror that won't hold still. Above the river bend, a thin dark layer settles over last season's cattails. It smudges fingers and tastes bitter. Archaeologists call it a black mat. It lies like a horizon inside the ground, a thin carbon-rich smear that turns up at sites from the American Southwest to the mid-Atlantic, and in other regions far from those shores. In this layer, unusual things clump together. Soot, tiny diamonds formed under high pressure, and spikes of a metal that doesn't usually gather in such abundance. Platinum stands out in assays like a flare. The layer marks a boundary, a before and after. In lab notes, it's a line. To a village on that river, it was a season that made new rules and broke old ones. Under the cold, rivers change their minds. Edges lock into ice. Channels that once braided into feeder creeks turn stiff and quiet, and the fish that fed families in late spring are gone. The hunter marks days by the way frost climbs willow bark. Time slows, then stretches thin. The people begin to carry stories the way they carry ember keepers, nesting coals in ash against their chest to move the heat from camp to camp. If your library burned, what single truth would you pass to a child with nothing but their two hands to hold it? Maybe this: mark the sky. Count the days between the longest night and the first thaw. Trust the pattern when the game does not return. The debates continue. Was it a cosmic shock or a plumbing change in the planet's waterworks? Supporters suggest a skyborne trigger left fingerprints. Those tiny diamonds born in high energy, the platinum peaks, the soot that whispers of wildfire on a scale a single summer could not match. Critics counter that meltwater pulsed through new routes and shut down ocean currents that carry heat. They point to volcanoes that can load the air with sunlight dimming dust, making winter out of summer without any need for stones from space. Both sides agree on one thing: the cooling was abrupt. In that abruptness, the human scale comes into focus. A woman at the river mouth cuts strips of frozen fish with a blade of flaked stone, then wraps the meat in bark to keep wind off the wet. She tells a child to remember how the moon looks when the cold first bites, and how the river smells when it lets go. These are instructions folded into a story. The wind picks up. The scent is metal and wet clay. They move their camp to a knoll that never floods, and the man with the leather strap makes a new snare, this time for rabbits inside the tree line. The old map of their year no longer fits. They begin to draw a new one in their heads. Evidence from ice cores shows the temperature drop gaining speed like a stone falling into a well. The curves are steep, the change measured in decades, not centuries. In the ground, dark horizons sit above older, lighter soils. Within those dark bands, tests find anomalies that match the tale of fire and sudden winter. The pattern tilts in the light and sharpens, cooling, soot, exotic signatures, and a timestamp centered near that 12,800 year mark. The pieces don't settle into one clean story. They cluster around a moment that asks you to hold two possibilities at once: a planet with a twitchy thermostat, and a sky that sometimes throws hard stones. We reach for language that can carry both. A sudden snapback after warming, a return to near glacial under a world that had started to green. On the ground, that would look like grasses giving up, tree lines stalling, water turning to crust, and animals doing algebra with hunger. People adjust by making their knowledge smaller and sharper. When a big picture breaks, a proverb fits in your hand. The black mat sits in North American sites, but echoes turn up elsewhere. At different latitudes, sediments hold their own signals. The exact mix differs. That's how local ecosystems write their own notes. One valley's soot is another valley's influx of silt. The same cold presses on both, but the marks it leaves change with what it lands on. This is why arguments about one cause or many bloom and persist. The world rarely picks a single lever. Around the fire, stories stretch to hold what numbers can't reach. A line becomes a warning. When the sky scratches, get to high ground. A number becomes a chant: 7 nights of dark, and then watch for the first clear star. These are mnemonics, not myths in the sense of fable, but tools. You don't need to know why the sea rose or the air went hard. You need to know what to do when it does. Children practice the words because practice is easier than hunger. The adult who can read clouds becomes the oracle of a village without books. Critics counter that we risk reading too much into layered dirt. They remind us that rivers shift all the time, currents change for reasons that don't require a comet, and fires can sweep a continent under a dry wind without help from the sky. Some whisper that the black mat's glittering particles could come from more ordinary stresses, a planet shrugging after a long ice age, not a single violent guest. The caution is healthy. It keeps us from turning every odd grain into a sign. And yet, the cold remains sudden. The graph isn't a sigh, it's a drop. For those living through it, the drama didn't need a narrator. The spring thaw arrived late, the summer felt stingy, and winter wrapped early. In those years, the band at the river learned to trap smaller game and watch constellations like clocks. When a known pattern returns, even under a new sky, it feels like a friend at the door. The people built a school in their mouths and hands because walls were not always an option. If a real cataclysm struck, the tales about floods and fire might be more than stories. They might be the last pages of an earlier chapter, copied by many hands into the next book. You can hear this possibility under the surface of the data. The black horizons, the diamonds no bigger than dust, the metal that gleams in abnormal quantity, the quick dive in temperature in ice far north. None of these prove a single cause on their own. Together they pull the mind toward a tight span of years when much went wrong at once. A father shows his child how to sharpen a point against wet sandstone. He points to where the river ice thins first and names that place for the sound it makes. He sets a rule: never sleep when the wind turns east after a day of warm. Rules become survival in times when the ground does not keep its promises. He remembers the last fat spring and holds it in his jaw like a word he doesn't say out loud. He ties knowledge into knots of habit. He does not think about monuments. He thinks about breakfast. Years pass under the long chill. Then, at last, the trend shifts. Warmth returns, hesitant, then steadier. The river lets go earlier. Plants push higher up the slopes. People who have learned to track tiny changes start to plan further out again. Their stories have grown in detail because details kept them alive. Those stories do not fade when the cold retreats. They harden into teachings. They pair with places. A hill becomes not just a hill, but a safe mark. A notch in rock becomes a month. A line of stacked stones becomes a horizon you can carry with you and set against the sky. The geological clock ticks close to the age of memory that hums beneath so many old tales. Around 12,800 years ago, something turned. Whether from sky or sea change, the winter pressed hard, quick, and wide. The echo in ice and earth is faint now, but it aligns with the whispers in firelight about the night the world lurched. You don't need certainty to hear the rhyme. You need a willingness to let science and story stand near each other without shouting. The overlap is not proof, it is invitation. After the freeze lifts, people start to gather at places that measure time without a written line. Stones rise where there are no fields yet, as if the first harvest is not grain but memory anchored in the ground. A ring catches the sunrise on a day that matters. A pillar holds carvings of animals from a season the kids should never forget. The sky becomes the oldest book in an open-air library, and someone decides to set that book in stone so the next storm won't wash the lesson away. Dawn finds the ridge cold and chalky underfoot. The air smells like wet limestone and crushed thyme, and a faint breeze pushes dust along the ledge where the first light reaches the T-shaped pillars. Foxes, cranes, scorpions, a vulture with a slung head. Each figure rises from stone so pale it almost glows. A headless human form holds itself in a stiff, uneasy calm. Nothing up here hums or clicks. Only a quiet that belongs to high ground and old work. The hilltop stands above the valley by a long climb, 1,000 feet or so, and the ground has the scraped look of a place used hard. Out beyond the slope, fields roll in soft greens and browns. Up here, it's bare limestone and cut faces, with trenches where men once pried blocks loose. You can put your palm to the T-pillar and feel the fine grit, the tool marks still faint along the edge. These pillars reach twice your height. Some weigh more than a truck. They stand in rings, with two taller stones set at the centre like sentries who never rest. This place took shape long before fields and towns. Radiocarbon dates tie the first enclosures to around 9,600 BCE. That's early, by any measure. The scale breaks the neat order of a timeline where farming builds villages and villages build temples. Here, a ceremonial complex rises when people still live by foraging and the hunt. No houses cluster on the summit. No hearths burn in neat rows. Yet the effort poured into these circles reads like a project with leaders, rules, patience, and a plan measured in seasons of labour. Walk the rim of enclosure D, and your steps trace an oval that once held a tight wall. The central pair of monoliths stand taller than the rest. Their broad faces carry belts and hands carved low on the shafts, turning the T into a stylized body. Around them, smaller pillars point inward like a council held in stone. Reliefs curl across the surfaces, a fox with a sharp snout and tucked tail, a crane mid-step, a scorpion arched and ready. Abstract marks, H-like signs, notches, lines, repeat with a rhythm that feels intentional even if the key to it is missing. The quarry scars sit a short walk downslope. Cut trenches bracket half-freed blocks, and spoil piles spill along the edges. You can see where a team worked a seam, driving wedges and prying up a slab from the bedrock. Stone tools did the work here. Flint blades, hammer stones, maybe wooden levers and ropes. Nothing suggests metal, yet 10-ton pillars moved from hillside to ring were set upright and dressed with careful hands. A line of men could do it with rollers, sleds and grit. A line of seasons too. The labour is not magic, it is relentless. Even so, a puzzle remains. How do bands of hunter-gatherers coordinate quarrying, hauling, carving, and the setting of stones this size? How do they plan an enclosure, appoint a place for each pillar, shape reliefs with a shared style, then repeat the process across multiple rings? The answer some give is ritual. Feasts can pull people over great distances, and ritual can bind them to tasks beyond daily needs. The bones left here, gazelle in great number, point to large gatherings like that. Meat roasted, fat hissed on hot slabs, stories travelled with the smoke. Klaus Schmidt, who led years of excavation, held that the ridge served as a sacred hub, a human-built holy place. He noted its height over the valley and the absence of dwellings up top. The pattern fits a site where people come to gather, mark time and enact shared rites, then leave. Later studies add social detail, suggesting feasting and communal work could organise labour without a town's bureaucracy. Critics counter the more colourful claims about lost civilizations by pointing to how ritual alone can raise stones, when the belief runs strong enough. One fact stands out and refuses to fade. After centuries of use, the builders buried the circles. Around 8000 BCE, they filled the enclosures with rubble and soil. Pillar tops went under, edges vanished. Once proud relief saw only darkness and weight. The fill includes tool chips and bones, which implies speed. Not a slow fall into ruin, but an act. Why hide the rings on purpose? Some whisper it was a rite of closure, ending a cycle. Others suggest it was protection, a way to preserve a map of meaning in a world that had begun to change. The gesture reads like forethought, not neglect. That headless figure keeps drawing eyes. The posture is steady, arms against the body, belt sharp around the waist. On the belt, a fox curls like a pocket guardian. On a low stone nearby, vultures attend to headless bodies. In some places, vultures link to excarnation, the exposure of the dead so Sky Carrion can clean the bones. Here, the scene could carry that practice. It could also hold a myth about loss and return. The symbols repeat, but not at random. A loop forms between animal, human, and the open sky. Stand still as the sun climbs, and you notice how the stone faces hold light on one side, then on the other. The rings catch morning, then soften by noon, then throw long shapes by late day. Some alignments may track the seasons, the exactness is argued. Yet the format, twin pillars at centre, a circle of watchers, narrative reliefs, creates a room where the sky seems to teach. You don't need numbers on a tablet if the light itself draws out the lesson. It lands where it always lands once a year with clean certainty. Cords and stakes can lay out circles. A rope fixed at a point can sweep a true curve. You can see the geometry and the tightness of the enclosures. A carver's hand, rough with lime dust, drags along the pillar face, following a curve taught by habit, not by math class. The tool chatters on a hard grain, then smooths over a softer streak. He repeats a fox's spine the way his father taught him, the way someone taught his father. He would not say he invented it. He would say he is keeping a pattern clean. The summit's view matters. From up here the horizon is a low, clean line. If someone wished to pin the year to a certain point where the sun rises, this ledge would help. A crane carved on a pillar might stand for a season when cranes return to water. A scorpion might mean the heat and danger of late summer, or a star cluster with that shape. A vulture might speak to rites for the dead or the north wind. The ring could hold a syllabus, animals and star times, lessons for when to gather, when to move, when to plant wild seed in a cleared patch so next year brings more. The stone tools on site tell a practical story. Flint blades snap and dull. They need new edges in a daily rhythm. Piles of chips sit where hands sat. People worked here in shifts. That level of organisation asks for food, water, rest, and a reason to stay with the task. Feasting remains fill the gaps. Tens of thousands of gazelle bones suggest drives or hunts, timed with migration. A ring of meat turns labour into festival. The festival turns a hilltop into a place of power. The place of power keeps people coming back. Skeptics keep their case close. No need to conjure a hidden civilization to explain this ridge. Give belief a focus, give groups a reason to meet, and the stones rise. Ritual can mobilize. Trade routes can carry styles and motifs without empires. The people down in the valleys knew stone and rope. They knew how to plan and share. They could set goals that reached beyond a single season. All of that fits a world still centuries away from wheat fields and oxen. Yet the mood of the site makes a different thought flicker. The pillars feel like rings of memory, as if what stands here is not the first try, but a recovery after a long winter of the world. Radiocarbon puts the build right after a climatic snapback. If knowledge bled out in a crisis, this could be a place where the survivors chose to fix what they could in limestone. They carved the animals that told time. They fixed human forms with belts and hands to say, this is the shape we carry forward. They made the lessons too heavy to burn. Enclosure D reads like a chapter, not a full book. Other rings, A, B, C, hold different mixes of creatures and signs. The effect suggests a sequence, a curriculum even. Start with the fox and crane and the low path of winter sun. Move next to the vulture and scorpion and the long days. Use the twin centre pillars as the axis. Measure the year by light. Mark the sky's turn with a story etched in the place where the shadow falls. No script required. The stone and the sun do the counting. Later the people buried their work. The fill pinned every relief into darkness. Why end it that way? Maybe a new way of life rose in the valleys, and the hilltop grew less central. Maybe the rites required closure, or a threat arrived, and the safest archive was no longer open air, but a mound that looked like nothing. Either way, the choice preserves. The rings became a time capsule, set to wait for a future with spades, brushes and questions. Touch the notch at the edge of a pillar. It bites your fingertip. The depth is shallow, but the mark is assertive, like a tally. Not all marks describe animals. Some are bars, chevrons, H-shapes. They may encode counts, days, moons, cycles, or groups. A rope and a notch can pass down a ratio better than a spoken line can survive long years. If so, the design here is more than ritual. It is instruction, the kind that can run even when the teacher has left. A worker rests on his heels, forearms dusty, thumbnail grey with lime. He runs a tool down the belly of a stone fox and checks the curve by feel. Behind him, a boy holds a rope and waits for the next pull to steady a pillar. The boy will grow into the next set of hands. He will not learn to write. He will learn when the cranes return and what the notch means on the third pillar from the left. His test will be whether the ring holds through winter and whether the people arrive on time for the feast. Some whisper that foxes stand for the trickster stars, the ones that seem to shift place over long spans. Others say cranes are just cranes, and the carving is the joy of making life from rock. The truth may sit between. Symbols can carry both spirit and schedule. One phrase speaks to the heart and keeps the practice alive. The other anchors the practice to a date that does not drift with memory. Look out over the valley now and see the faint line of a river where morning mist rises. Along those banks, much later, fields will stitch into place. Villages will appear. But up here, for a brief chapter, a group set a different kind of seed. They fixed meaning into pillars and taught time without a clock. They gathered people with food and song, and they codified memory in shapes that light can find once a year. The work feels early and old at the same time. When you descend the slope, the dust sticks to your shoes. The wind has picked up and the air tastes chalky. Behind you, the rings sit in their open mounds, some still half buried. some freed enough to catch a stray beam. The sight does not solve itself by a quick look. It asks a slower reading, one that allows stone to speak in light and animals to point the way through the year. It asks whether recovery can look like invention when the past has been forgotten. If knowledge can sleep in these rings and wake when the topsoil lifts, then memory can live in limestone. And if memory can live in limestone, it might have found another refuge where it could wait out the centuries under a different kind of weight. Down where the waves roll and retreat, the seafloor has its own shelves, its own ledges, its own places to hide a chapter, until someone learns to listen through water. Off India's western coast, the Gulf of Kambat is brown and fast, fed by rivers that carry entire mountains as dust. Here, a scan once caught, shapes spread across kilometres, rectangles, linear features, what look like block fields and causeways. Near Dwarka, farther up the coast where the water clears to a jade tint, divers talk about dressed stones and simple walls that turn at sharp angles before they vanish into the murk. Southward and far away, near Yonaguni in Japan, a staircase drops into blue water. Flat faces meet at 90 degrees, and a ledge runs like a corridor until the surge lifts you away. The draw is simple. After the last ice age, seas rose by roughly 120 metres. The shoreline walked inland. What was once coastal plain became continental shelf. Any low town or ritual site at the water's edge now sleeps under waves. That number has weight. It explains why sonar boats hug outlines of ancient bays, why divers follow old river mouths into open sea, why maps of submerged terraces make eyes narrow and pens slow. Where people clustered, the water later climbed. At Kambat, teams reported fields of stone that look placed rather than tumbled. They lifted artifacts as the cables thumped the hull, then dropped the dredge again. Some pieces turned out to be shaped, others plain. Dates did not line up cleanly. A bed might test older than a carved fragment beside it. Critics counter that powerful currents stir this gulf like a pot, carrying bone, wood and stone from different ages into the same eddies. In that churn, a single haul can mix centuries the way tide lines mix leaves on a beach. Still, the shapes keep pulling attention. There are straight runs that lengthen as silt lifts, then fade when the tide turns. At Dwarka, a line of blocks forms a corner you can follow by touch alone. Your hand slides over a groove and grit grinds under the glove at a point where a tool might have bitten. The water presses cold through the suit, and in a moment of stillness the sand falls back like a curtain, then closes again. The sea guards its pages. Yonaguni is clearer. The steps are bold and clean when the surge is gentle. Terraces drop in wide, flat layers. There's a triangle platform, a trench like a channel, and pillars that look as if they were cut from the bedrock, not stacked. Some whisper that a ceremonial complex lies here, the remains of work by hands that knew how to mark space with rhythm and angle. Others dismiss the tidy decks as sandstone doing what sandstone does, breaking along joints, shedding slabs, forming neat edges by fault and wave. You can watch currents comb the edges smooth like a whetstone at work. It takes patience to separate pride of craft from the logic of geology. A diver once scraped a finger along a step and found a notch with squared corners, a small detail that felt like a decision rather than an accident. The ocean did not agree to pause for debate. Bubbles rose in a chain and broke on the surface as the swell lifted the boat. Later on deck, the team laid out fragments on a tarp, a shard with striations, a rounded piece that might be a weight, a lump of wood that crumbled in air. Dates came back like scattered birds, some too old for the context, some young enough to be intrusive. A single clear line would have been easy. The sea offered noise. The broader map matters. Meltwater pulses did not raise a bathtub. They stepped the sea up in surges, flooding deltas and bays, biting deeper with each tide. Old inlets became drowned valleys. Bays that once held fishermen and small shrines now hold silt and fish. On many shelves, drowned river channels still show in relief, winding like dark ropes across pale sand. Follow those ropes, and you find terraces that match ancient shorelines. The logic says, walk the old coast in your mind, then drop your anchor just beyond it. In India, a chief geologist read the Kambat signals as the footprint of a planned site. He spoke of a culture before the Harappan, a mother line erased by the sea. The claim struck a chord because it fits the water's rise, yet the Gulf is a machine for mixing. Another scholar noted that rivers carry artefacts out to sea, then lay them down in patterns that look meaningful from above. A third voice warned about dates that drift when samples move from one layer to another. The debate has held steady as a tide that never quite turns. At Yonaguni, a marine geologist mapped the blocks like rooms, suggesting links to a coastal culture known to make pottery and ritual objects. It's a tidy frame. People near the water build with stone, then the water takes the work away. Skeptics point back to the bedrock. Sandstone stacks in plates. Currents shave corners. Erosion can be patient and precise, given a steady hand of wave and wind. Stand in the surge with your toes on a ledge and you feel both stories, the human urge to mark, the Earth's own habit of breaking on lines. Under the boat, the towfish rattles again. The operator marks waypoints where right angles repeat. The screen freezes for a breath as the software catches up. On paper, because pen still matters out here, someone draws a simple rectangle and writes the depth. The deck smells of rope and salt. A gull watches from the rail and does not care about global timelines. We sketch because pattern helps memory. The sea has its own ways of keeping things, but it does not keep them for us. Reports from these coasts include carved pieces that look like anchors, or weights with perforations, and stone blocks with lip and groove joints that darken at depth. Yet collections assemble like patchwork. Some items come from dredges, not from controlled digs. Currents move tags as easily as shells. One survey shows a clear line. Another, on a different day with different silt, shows a blur. Supporters suggest that repeated passes over seasons build a stable picture. Critics counter that the Gulf shifts too quickly to lock down provenance without heavy infrastructure and long campaigns. There is a quieter clue. Where we find myths of sea cities, the shelf often drops near a drowned delta. The match is not proof. It is a rhyme. Coastal people tell sea stories. But there is a practical reason those tales cluster at the edges. The edge moved. A person living at the old shore would have watched land shrink each generation. A shrine gets wet feet, then wet steps, then only a marker cairn visible at low tide. The memory would hold a specific place where the tide turned mean. A diver's light in green water cuts a narrow tunnel. Particles drift like snow in a glass globe. A carved groove appears on a block. Parallel lines that meet at a crisp edge. Then the current swings and mud returns. The diver taps the groove with a knuckle and feels the bite. There's no speech down here, only breath, slow and measured. The mind fills the rest. Silt opens and closes as if it has a will. A promise kept, a page turned, a page withdrawn. The larger arc returns to sea level. Add 120 metres to today's coastlines and picture the ancient contours. Harbours move inward. Shelves that now attract trawlers once held beaches and kitchens and small courts where elders sat. It's not a stretch to say people lived there. They always do. The question is not whether the sea rose. The question is whether the lines we see belong to hands or to stone's own habits. That answer lives in tiny details, tool marks, shards in place, layers that make sense when the mud clears. In the Gulf of Kambat, the water is rarely clear. The surface chops in a fast rhythm, and even at slack tide, the rivers push a thin brown wall into the sea. Divers have to work by touch. A hand treads along a face until a right angle surprises the fingers, then the hand maps the edge while the mind draws. Up top, the GPS plots a box around the find. The box fills with more boxes. Each one is a small claim. Something stands here, not shaped by today's tide. Yonaguni gives different lessons. On a calm day, you can drift along a terrace and count steps with your fins. The light drops in layers. Fish flicker and vanish into slots that look like doorways. Then the surge lifts, and you must grab a hold or be taken. Touch the stone. It is rough, grainy, willing to flake along planes. Where two planes meet just right, the edge looks cut. The mind loves edges. It writes stories on them. The stone will do what it does whether you write or not. The case notes keep growing. A list of coordinates. A drawer with labelled fragments and dates. Some fine-grained charcoal, some shell, some bone. A hard drive full of side-scan mosaics where boxes stack on boxes and each box begs to be walked. Some whisper that with enough dives, a clear city grid will emerge under the tide lines, confirming a story older than the oldest bricks on land. Others dismiss the hope as the sea's trick, the way it turns dunes into walls and gullies into roads for an hour, then pushes the pattern into new places overnight. Even with the noise, one truth stays in view. The rise in water puts any early coastal culture under waves. If memory was stored on promontories, in keystones, on platforms at low tide, the ocean kept it for itself. That does not mean the records are gone. It means our reading room has poor light and sand on every page. We work slower. We grant weight to a groove you can feel twice on different days. We set aside the neat fix until the silt lets us earn it. You lean over the transom as the towfish comes up drip by drip. The metal is cold under your palm. A gull calls once, then the water settles. On the screen, the last pass shows a corner that repeats at a new angle. Not proof. Not yet. It is enough to return. If a coastal culture encoded memory at the shore, the ocean would hold the missing chapters between tides and storms, lending us a page at a time when the weather allows. The plausibility window is open, sea level rose where people lived, shelves hold drowned valleys and terraces at the right depths. Some edges look too straight, some grooves feel chosen. The story does not have to leap to grand claims to earn its keep. It only has to ask us to keep going back, to let more boxes fill with detail until a plan either stands or falls to pieces under better light. If ruins under waves are echoes, the tales of cities claimed by the sea might be the voice that still carries over the surf, a hint of chapters written on stone, read now by touch, and waiting for the right tide to speak a little louder. A priest in Sumer bends over a clay tablet while the oil lamp gutters. He lines up reed marks and names the rulers who lived and died before the deluge. In the thin chill of a high Andean night, an elder points toward a ridge and says a lake once climbed those stones and did not fall back for a long time. 2 fires, 2 memories, one theme that moves like heavy water through time. Across old libraries and campfire rings, flood tales gather with the same bones. In Mesopotamia, a survivor receives a warning, builds a vessel, and rides it over a drowned world. In a Hebrew text, a family boards an ark and waits for water to recede. In India, a king listens to a speaking fish, ties his boat, and preserves seeds and sages. In Greece, a couple sets out in a chest and later sews humans from stones. In the Americas, storms sweep coasts. In mountains, torrents roar through valleys and erase tracks. The cast changes, the stage changes, yet the plot walks back in like a familiar guest. So what are we hearing? Moral tales that teach humility and justice, or fragments of real disaster tuned to local weather and terrain? The question rubs the edge where myth and memory touch. Rivers spill their banks everywhere. Seas have moods. Others dismiss the linkage and say flood stories travel well because floods do. That answer sits properly cautious. Still, the repetition of scaffolding across oceans nudges at the mind. When you check the ground against the telling, the calendar flickers at similar ranges. The late Pleistocene closed with sharp climate swings and rising seas. Shorelines pulled back from the edges of the world we know. Coastal shelves became water, and low valleys became bays. Oral timelines rarely count in numbered years, but settlement traces snap forward after long cold. New hearths, new trails, new tools on higher ground. The map changes shape. Villages relocate upslope. marsh turns to inlet. In the background, the ocean keeps climbing for millennia, stepping up in pulses. Supporters suggest that memories of such pulses settled into stories that held shape because they mattered. If your harbour drowned in your grandfather's youth, that loss would need a frame sturdy enough to teach a child where not to build. And if a storm season arrived with an anger no one alive had seen, the tale would harden into a lore. These accounts may be moral, yes, but they also tally risks and remedies, packaged for recall. Listen to the small techniques within the telling. A storyteller squats by a hearth, drags a finger through ash, and piles a ridge to show the height of water. He lifts his palm to his chest to mark the line. Bodies stand in for rulers and meters, the units are lived. He turns to the doorway and notes which star the rising water eclipsed first. He taps the roof pole and names the wind. This is not just drama. It is a survival note you can remember at a run. In some lineages, dates arrive sideways through the sky. A flood is placed in the season when a certain constellation first rose at dawn, or when a bright star hovered low over a hill. That choice matters. Stars repeat on long loops. If the tale ties to a celestial pattern, the memory can be folded into a cycle far longer than a single lifetime. It turns a one-time shock into a recurring warning tuned to the heavens. The old Mesopotamian episode describes a crafted boat with sealed seams and careful cargo. The Hebrew ark gathers pairs of animals and a promise when the sky clears. The Indian account preserves seeds and teachers. The Greek couple restarts a world by throwing stones with intent. The Andean wave leaves herders counting the missing. In each, the content list reads like a sober inventory of what a community might save. Food, knowledge, people, animals, tools, a way to keep time. Even the odd details, like sending a bird to test the shoreline, carry practical sense. Now, the ground. After the late Pleistocene, coastlines redrew themselves. Sea level rose on the order of 100 metres from the last glacial maximum over thousands of years, but not smoothly. Meltwater pulses sped things up. Storms reshaped beaches in a season. Drowned river mouths turned into estuaries where people had once found shellfish, wood, and easy travel. Camps that once sat a day's walk from the surf became seabeds. The shelf hid any memory you did not carry in your mouth or carve into rock. Critics counter that if you collect stories long enough, you will find one to match any event. They warn about cherry-picking and the desire to weave a neat global plot out of local threads. That caution is healthy. Much of human life happens in floods, so of course myths carry them. But a second detail tugs. Many of these tales do not just narrate one household emergency. They speak of waters that erase the known world, or at least the known coast. They use mountain lines as their yardsticks and repeat themes of teaching and restart. That scale is a different animal. Trace the timing. Oral patterns tend to anchor in human generations. A memory with strong ritual backing can last a very long time. Perform it, sing it, tie it to a monument that lights on a certain day, and you have a reef where memory can gather and recover after storms. Some whisper that the deepest flood motifs could reach back to the last great cooling and the messy thaw that followed. We cannot prove that span, but the alignment sits within a plausible human chain when upheld by symbol and ceremony. Take a kitchen moment. A grandmother sets a bowl on a low table and draws 3 arcs with flour. The smallest arc is the annual wet season, she says. The middle arc is the storm that moved the village when she was young. The wide arc belongs to her grandmother's mouth, when a lake rose to the chest of the prayer stones down valley. She cannot say the year, she can show the curve, she can point to the ridge where people ran. Her grandson remembers her hand and the curve, not the number. Odd echoes show up in star terms. A tribe notes the flood happened in the age when a certain animal shape lived at the eastern horizon before dawn, not in a numbered year. Another counts after a bright star vanished behind smoke for a season and returned dimmer. These are not calendars as we keep them now. They are pointers you can share even if your words change. If the holder knows the sky, the message survives the crossing. Put all this together and the flood tale begins to look like a compression format for Risk. It keeps the outline clean, warning, preparation, vessel, mountain, signal, return, and fills it with local parts you can swap out. It says what to carry first. It tells which hill worked as a refuge. It encodes the sign to launch and the sign to wait. It carries names that open doors in your group so you can gather help without debate. If you are making a story to live long and save lives, you might choose these bones too. There are smaller regional twists that make sense on the ground. In one valley, the heroes bring seed stock and a calendar staff. In another, they mould the first bricks when the mud dries and mark them with a symbol of a boat. In one coast, the wave comes before dawn and the moon hangs low, so the tide becomes part of the memory. In a highland, the threat comes as rain that has forgotten how to stop, so the song names Days of Grey. The variety strengthens the case. The template holds. The details suit the land. Skeptics point to the moral lessons, the warning against corruption, the mercy after judgment, and say that is the heart of it. They are not wrong. Public ethics survive better when wrapped in a story everyone knows by heart. But the ethics do not erase the logistics. They share the room. A covenant and a drainage plan can live in the same tale without strain. The story speaks to the gods and to the pantry. Another pattern hums under the words. After the waters settle, a teacher arrives. He or she brings a way to count days, a law to keep order, a method to plant when the season turns. The tide wipes the board clean. The next act opens with instruction. That rhythm matches how recovery works. First safety, then inventory, then time, then rules, then fields. The narrative moves the listener along that path almost like a training drill, masked as drama. If you grew up on a coast where the water had climbed once in living memory, you would store that ghost somewhere your children could find. You might carve it high on a cliff and mark the angle of a sunrise to it. You might sing it at planting so the tune keeps the steps. You might tell it in winter when hands are free and eyes look far. You might choose a hero with a human face so the fear stays near enough to respect. You would also add a moment of courage so the story does not only hurt. What if the chorus of floods across continents signals a shared inheritance? Not because a single ship sailed the world handing out tales, but because the sea and the sky taught the same hard lesson again and again. Stories learned the efficient way to hold that lesson and travelled along trade paths and marriages and travellers who never called themselves teachers. The pattern found its own way, like water searching a slope. The mind likes closure, but this thread asks for quiet patience. When the same plot repeats across oceans and languages, either humans share a taste for storm stories, or they share a memory that earned its way into ritual and survival kits. The two explanations do not cancel each other. They may be one thing seen from two benches at the same fire. If memory did endure inside these tales, someone had to carry the first kit after the waters went down, showing hands how to hold the new tools and voices how to count the new days. Where did those lessons come from, and who kept them alive long enough to be given a name? Waves breathe against broken pilings at low tide. The water smells of kelp and old wood. On the wet stones, a figure waits with a net over one shoulder and a bundle tied in oilskin. In the stories, this is where the lesson begins. A tall stranger steps from the surf and lays out signs on the sand. A painted cord for counting nights, a staff marked with notches, a flat stone scratched with lines that hint at words. He points to the moon, then to the seed head of a grass, and shows how the two talk to each other through time. Across far coasts, names change, but the role does not. In Egypt, Thoth stands with an ibis head and holds the stylus and the tablet. He keeps the ledger of days, measures shadows, and writes laws the way a careful hand draws water from a jar. In the high Andes, Viracocha rises from the lake after a flood and walks with a staff, setting order in towns and fields. He teaches rows, terraces, and the gentle rule that keeps peace while people rebuild. In Mesopotamia, Oannes climbs out of the sea with the face and feet of a man and the body of a fish, and he speaks the arts that make cities. In Mesoamerica, a feathered serpent serves as teacher and guide, bringing calendars and the craft of maize. The thread that ties them is practical. Each carries tools that turn chaos into habit. Writing appears with the stylus and the neat stroke. Calendars arrive as a wheel of days and a handful of stars that matter. Agriculture comes with the rhythm of water and the spacing of seed. Stonework arrives as plumb lines, right angles, and joints that do not wander. Law appears as simple phrases that sort quarrels before they spill. These are not thunderbolts and miracles, they are instructions. There is a question whispering underneath. Are these figures pure myth, divine masks that embody wisdom? Or are they hazy memory of real teachers who crossed into shocked communities after a hard season and offered what they knew? Supporters suggest the latter, casting the teachers as skilled survivors who saved a few ratios and rights when the world tilted. Critics counter that every society sanctifies invention by handing it to a god. New ways gain trust when placed in sacred hands. Both readings live in the same room. Watch how the stories place them. They often arrive by water, as if the shore is still raw from the last wave. They carry facial hair in regions where beards mark age and distance, a detail that can signal foreignness and experience. They stand against chaos, serpents of the deep storm gods, tempests that pull roofs away, bringing a counterweight in the form of calendars and conduct. When they leave, they do not slam the door. They vanish into the hills, the sea, or the sky, with the work meant to outlast them. In a small room lit by a clay lamp, a scribe grinds soot with a drop of gum and water. He tests the ink on his thumbnail, then leans over a reed fibre sheet. The glyph he copies is older than any king he can name. He does not know if the ancestor who first drew it met a god, or only a quiet person with a steady hand and a good memory. He knows that if he gets the curve wrong, the word becomes another word, so he rehearses the stroke in the air, then lets it fall. The page dries near the coals. His hands smell of smoke and gum. Thoth's toolkit is straightforward. The stylus, the scribe board, the balance for weighing truth, the count of days that marks planting and pilgrimage. When Thoth stands beside a ruler in painted halls, the image insists that time and language are older than the throne. Knowledge does not belong to one man's whim. It resides in an office, a role, a ritual. That framing makes new rules bearable. It also makes them hard to break. Viracocha's steps draw a route across the Andes. Chronicles describe him setting laws, teaching craft, and moving on. He carries a staff, a compact symbol of rank and guidance. Where he pauses, terraces rise. Fields gain contour and stone lips that sip rain at a steady rate. In bleak seasons, order like that keeps a village from starving. Assign it to a god, and no one argues when the work is hard. Oanne, from a priestly record, emerges from the sea and speaks the works of civilization. Writing, arts, laws, the building of temples and cities. The description is stitched through time, but its backbone is work a day. He does not smash mountains or still the wind. He holds classes. He leans toward the people and teaches until dark, then swims away. The lesson continues at dawn. The Feathered Serpent School is similar. Writing and timekeeping arrive alongside maze and craft. A book appears in the hand, a bundle of bark pages with lines that turn into days and stories. The teacher's form is not just an animal, it is a union, sky and earth, bird and snake, breath and ground. That union fits the job at hand. Make the heavens speak to the field, and the field will feed the city. These bundles always include a clock. A community that has just survived a ruin needs to know when to plant, when to build, when to move. A calendar is not a toy. It is a rescue rope thrown across years. The teachers give names to days and tie those names to light and rain. They turn the sky into a table you can use without math on paper. A child can learn it by song. A village can live by it with no library at all. The list is consistent. Writing gives memory a spine. Calendars keep people in sync with seasons. Laws lower the temperature of conflict so fields can be tended without fear. Agriculture feeds more than a camp. Stonework gives shelter that stands through long weather. Even the symbolic tools stay steady. Stylus, staff, book. The kit looks like a starter pack for rebuilding. Others dismiss the pattern as a straightforward function of power. When a new dynasty wants to lock a method in place, it says a god handed down the rule. The aura helps leaders command labour. That is a real dynamic. Yet the regularity of skills ascribed across long distances hints at a common triage list. After a burn or a flood, most communities would need the same few things. The gods may be embroidered in later. The underlying syllabus reads like a universal checklist. Another echo. The timing. These teachers often appear after a period of disorder. The flood recedes. The land is strange. People have moved to different ground. Food is uncertain. In that open field of confusion, a visitor with clear methods can change the arc of a generation. Whether that visitor has scales or a bird's head depends on the language of the place, not on the function of the lesson. Return to the scribe. He dips the reed and finishes the line. On the margin, he marks the day with a pair of careful strokes, then draws a small moon. He's not writing for a king tonight. He is copying a ritual calendar that tells when to fast, when to plant, when to haul stones for repairs on the temple. He reads with his thumb as much as with his eye. The groove of the board has taught his hand the width of a good line. Skill flows through tools. Tools have memory. Some whisper that the teachers carried memory not in stories alone, but in ratios and routines. A technique is easier to keep alive than a blueprint. You can teach a right angle with a rope, a triangle and a peg. You can teach a day count with a bundle of sticks, and the patient attention to a sunrise notch in a ridge. If your library is ash, knowledge that lives in repeated action has a better chance to survive. These figures, their names now gilded, may stand for that simple fact. Critics counter that convergent need can make convergent myth. Different peoples meet the same problems and solve them in similar ways, then retroactively grant those ways a divine origin. Innovation feels safer when it appears old and sanctioned. That line is reasonable and it guards against wishful links. It does not, however, dissolve the odd recurrences, waterborne arrivals, bearded teachers, opposition to chaos, and a lesson plan that reads like a rebuild manual. The setting of these dramas matters. Shorelines carry loss, lakes carry echoes. A stranger stepping from water is a shock you do not forget. The scene itself is an instruction. Look to the edge where worlds meet, for what comes next. The figure from the surf holds a net of signs, because what you need now is a harvest of meaning, not just fish. The net becomes a syllabus. Across the Hall of Time, these teacher gods show the same concern for counting. Teach numbers first, then words, then the rules that numbers help enforce. Timekeeping steadies anxiety, knowing that the next new moon belongs to the first sowing, and the second attending gives a fearful mind something to hold. People stand up straighter when the day has a name and a job. The teachers define that rhythm and make it public. Education is not a lecture on a bench. In these tales, it is a kit you can carry to a floodplain or a high terrace. The book is sometimes a literal bundle of pages, but often it is a set of proportions, a way to tie knots, a pattern for laying out a wall true to the vertical. The pencil mark you make today can align with light you will never see. That kind of knowledge bends toward endurance. The human detail keeps pulling us back. The scribe licks a cracked lip and lifts the page, waving it gently to dry. He stacks it near the wall. Tomorrow he'll carry it to a room where a priest checks the crest of the river, then checks the line of the sunrise against the temple. They will talk in low voices about the week. The page will enter a chest tied shut with cord. ink is fragile. The habit that makes the ink is stronger. If the teacher figures carried memory through a bad age, where did they keep it safe? In bark pages that can rot? In the heads of a few survivors with long lifespans and careful diction? Or in ratios that show up wherever rope and peg meet dirt? In stone passages calibrated to catch a winter beam? In songs that count to a number with a meaning? Supporters suggest that numbers and proportions are the least leaky vessels. You can lose a word and still keep a square. The small payoff is plain when you strip away the shimmer. The mythic syllabus fits the first needs of people starting over. Time to plant. Rules to keep quarrels from breaking the group. Food to last the lean months. Shelter that can weather the year. The teachers do not gift palaces. They gift sequences. Do this, then this, then this, and the next spring will be yours. That structure may be the real treasure under the masks. Our path now bends from words to walls. If teachers taught time and rule, someone also cut stone to catch the sun in a narrow shaft on a certain day. Those stones do not forget as quickly as ink. They hum with a different kind of memory, one you feel on your skin when a beam of winter light finds a mark in a cool chamber, and a whole village knows the season has turned. A narrow beam of winter sun threads a stone passage, low and sure, and lands on a carved spiral that glows like a coal. The air in the chamber feels heavier than the air outside, as if light has weight today. Breath fogs. Someone's wool sleeve rasps against rough wall. Then the beam shifts a finger's width, and the glow fades, and with it comes a soft release in the room, the kind of quiet that follows a bell you cannot hear. You find these rooms in different lands, raised by hands that never met. In a green valley, a mound shaped by turf hides a corridor that waits all year for the sun to find it on one particular morning. Far south, on a dry lake bed long gone to dust, low stones sketch lines to horizons and mark the places where the sky's clock ticks. In cities of stepped platforms, stairways meet the sunrise and cast a blade of shade that lands clean on a marker stone. You can stand inside each and feel the same idea take shape. Architecture as a measure, a building that does not just shelter a body, but catches time. The question hangs like a lamp over the lintel. Are these acts of theatre a way to stage the turn of the year with a play of light and shadow? Or are they instruments, tuned and tested, able to call out the days to plant, the days to fast, the days to walk? Some whisper that both can be true. A ritual can be a rehearsal for a calendar. A festival can double as a course correction when weather lies. The stone does not care which face you present to it. It records the moment all the same. At a mound in Ireland, winter solstice dawn arrives on a blade so thin it seems to cut the dark. The passage frames an angle that only works when the sun sits lowest in the year. For minutes, a stone spiral wakes to gold, and the community that squeezed into the cold space knows the long night is bent. In the Egyptian desert at Nabta Playa, the wind scrubs a basin where circles of stone still point to seasonal risings. Alignments linked to the summer sun that once brought a turning of rains, long before the sands took the basin's water. In Mesoamerican centres, temples fix their faces towards solstices and equinoxes, so the sun's shadow steps like a metronome across stair edges and lintels. None of this is small work. It takes watching, trial, and a memory you can pass down by walking a path the same way every year. Orientation matters. Move a wall a few degrees and you miss the day. Build the passage a little off and the beam will never find its mark. The builders learned their horizons. They traced the sun's swing and the way stars climb at angles no one would guess on the first try. You can almost see the process in your mind. Stakes in a field, strings pulled tight, a patient watcher returning with a stick of charcoal to mark light's edge on a nearby stone. When those marks repeated, they cut a passage that replayed that moment with precision. The room became a calendar you could walk into. This brings a different kind of tension. If a monument holds a working calendar, was it made by people playing at ritual, or by a crew of quiet observers who kept notes with rope and shadow. Critics counter any urge to overreach and say that careful alignments do not demand advanced science, only observation and persistence. That pushback is fair. Still, repetition at scale, across continents, asks us to hold the craft in respect. The data are in the stones, solstice and equinox orientations, alignments to rising points that matter for travel and farming, and in some cases hints that slow star drift, the long wobble of Earth's axis, was noticed and folded into ceremony. Others dismissed the precession claims as reading too much into patterns. The wobble takes many lifetimes to make itself obvious. The debate continues in the background while the light keeps landing on the same spiral each winter. Waiting makes the method visible. A caretaker arrives before dawn and leans a shoulder to the lintel as frost paints the grass. He checks the horizon for a clean line and stamps his feet to bring feeling back. He carries a small bundle of sage or damp green twigs to scent the space. He does not need to know the math to know when the moment is right. When the beam threads the passage and finds its target, he nods once and lets the whisper pass down the line to the crowd at his back. The gesture says, "Winter turns here. You can feel the year pivot in your bones. Sound has its place in these rooms too. On an island in the Central Sea, an underground complex bends the voice into a tunnelled note that hangs in the chest. Tess suggests a chamber there hums around a tone near 110 cycles per second, a low pitch that makes ribs vibrate and thoughts slow. Speak there, and words gain a body they lack outdoors. Did the builders shape that on purpose? Supporters suggest they did, guiding sound down corridors to train memory by sensation, not just by ear. Critics counter that neat effect can arise by chance in caves and catacombs. Either way, the human inside the room learns something without being told. Rhythm becomes a tool for recall. Light and tone repeat with clockwork if you prepare the space, and let the sky do the rest. That's the quiet trick. A building like this does not need a priest to hold the rulebook every time. The horizon and the sun bring the appointment whether or not anyone remembers to show. People learn it because their bodies feel it. The squint at the edge of winter, the chest thrum in the chamber, the warmth on a cold face when a door-sized sun appears. That is instruction you cannot lose when scripts burn or words shift. Now comes the speculation at the edge. If stone can store an event in a repeatable way, like an annual light strike or a seasonal note that shakes the body, a community can encode tasks alongside it. When light hits the spiral, break ground. When the shadow reaches the marker, bring grain to an altar for counting. When the echo pops twice at dusk, fishermen tie their nets and wait 3 days. These are not far-fetched rules. They look like the bones of a farmer's calendar built into doors and passages. There's also the longer view. Some researchers see signs in certain alignments that hint at awareness of slow cycles. The Earth's axis drifts across a broad loop that takes about 26,000 years to finish. Over human spans, that drift shows up as a gradual shift in where a star rises along the horizon on the same date. If a culture reset alignments across generations to hit the same seasonal markers, their buildings become a record of tiny, careful corrections. Others caution against drawing that line. Star law is messy, and weather can interfere for years. It is hard to prove intent when a choice of a few degrees can be chalked up to local terrain. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens for a moment, then slides back into the murk. The human anchors do not argue these points. A farmer watches a temple stairway swallow shadow to the last step and knows it's time to move seedlings from shade to soil. A pilgrim keeps vigil at a plaza where the equinox sun splits a shrine's doorway and he starts a long walk the next morning. A child crawls behind an elder through a cold passage before dawn and learns patience by shiver and breath. Lessons arrive without a chorus of rules. The room teaches. There are side effects that read like design. In certain chambers, tones build and cancel until a single frequency hangs like a cord across the room. People inside hum along without thinking, their breath falling into sync. The moment sticks in memory because their bodies mark it as special. In open plazas, the clap of a hand bounces from stone risers to return as a short roll, a trick that lets huge crowds hear a signal at once. Whether ritual or trick of the ear, these details show a habit of tying events to repeatable effects you can trust with no text. Critics counter that modern eyes hunt for precision where old builders cared more for story. The counter-argument says we overlay graphs on shrines and then applaud the fit. That warning keeps hubris in check, yet the inversions matter too. If you set out to create only a mood, getting the sunrise dead on down a narrow corridor to land on a specific mark one morning a year would be an extravagant waste of effort for a small payoff. It seems more likely that the mood and the measure were the same art. At a site where a platform meets the dawn, people still gather long before light. Blankets shake, breath shows. There is hushed talk about the crops, about a cousin on the road, about the rumour that the river ran high this week. Someone taps a bowl with a stick to keep a steady beat. When the sun breaks and the shadow falls as expected, the beat stops. There is a shared exhale. A calendar flips you can feel. You don't need writing on a wall to know what comes next. Across regions, details shift. In a desert, alignments watch stars that signal rain. On a coast, a shrine faces where the first dry wind arrives after storm season. In the high north, a circle tracks the long day's first drop back toward night. Everywhere, the monument chooses a marker that maps to need. The common thread is not a single blueprint, but a habit. Trap a celestial event in a structure so anyone can recall it on time. Strip the theory down to a simple thought. A stone layout is a program. You run it by standing in the right place at the right season and letting the sky input the rest. The output is a sign that says start, stop, wait, go. It is robust against lost pages. If a generation forgets a song, the sun will remind them. If a keeper of the keys falls ill, the equinox still slices a temple in half. This is architecture as durable code. You don't have to read it to use it. Light and sound carry more than dates. They carry a mood that makes people care. The glowing spiral turns the coldest morning into a promise. The deep note ties a chest to stone and settles a crowd into the same breath. Meaning lands in the body before the mind can argue. That is a sturdy place to store a calendar. This method could bridge storms, migrations, and the slow drift of language. If time can be kept in these forms, other messages can ride them. Lines and curves etched along passage walls start to repeat in far places, and the same shapes that wrap a solstice also thread their way onto lintels and stones. The next layer of the system is waiting right there on the faces of the blocks, a quiet set of signs that rhyme even when words don't. Serpents coil around staffs, suns flare from stone, eyes stare from lintels that still throw shade at noon. Walk from a desert shrine to a jungle stairway and the glyphs begin to rhyme, not in words, but in shapes your hands already know. A circle carries a season, a spiral carries motion, a snake runs along a wall and becomes a river, a vein, a piece of time that turns back on itself. A boat rides a lintel as if a threshold were a sea. A tree lifts a trunk through worlds, or a pillar holds a roof like a frozen axis you can touch. The grammar sits in form before it tries for language. Think of the circle first. It shows up scratched into pottery, cut into capstones and pressed into wet clay. It is not a signature in ink. It is the sun, a drum, a seed, a year you can roll. Turn the circle once and you get a loop. Pull it out and you get a spiral, a path that moves and remembers where it's been. That spiral turns on megaliths, where the winter light finds it at dawn. It turns in petroglyphs on canyon walls and in shell inlay on small talismans. The shape does not need you to read a script. Your body reads it as return. Now lay a serpent against that loop. The snake is a line with life. In some places it grows feathers and rises as a god with a calendar's brain. In others it swallows its tail and closes the system. Far north, It coils so large it girds the known world. In the high Andes it moves as a maru, current and rain braided together. The same line marks a channel on a temple panel and flows like water, and it marks a path of stars that drift slow across decades. A single motif handles both river and time because both move, both flood, both recede. Set a boat beside that. Across coasts and inland lakes, a painted vessel glides along funerary walls and also across the mind. It speaks of passage you must take, across storms, across a night sky, across the gap between years. It sits under a load of seeds or a cargo of stories. It rests on a sarcophagus lid as if to promise a crossing that is not measured in miles. In island chains far out on the ocean, canoes are maps. Out on floodplains, a skiff is a memory that keeps a family line above water. When the season turns, the boat says through. Now grow a tree or raise a pillar and let it hold the roof. The tree climbs 3 levels in a single image. Root below, branch above, a spine in the middle. It can carry birds with messages and snakes with data. A pillar does much the same without leaves. It lets you count with notches. It is a meter you can lean on. When set in rings, pillars speak to each other and to the horizon. One marks where the sun dies in winter, another catches a star rising green. The axis is not only an idea, it is a tool that holds the weight of a dome and the weight of a calendar at once. Critics counter that people everywhere watch the same sky and move among the same dangers, so the images will match even if no one ever met. Circle, snake, boat, tree, pillar. These are things you meet young. Others dismiss a grand link as a romance stitched from scattered finds. The warning is fair, loose matches are easy. It is harder to prove a sentence when all you have is a set of signs. Yet some pairings build pressure when they cluster with ritual and stone that acts on light. Watch how a symbol clicks into place when a structure uses the sky. A spiral carved deep in a dark chamber lights at dawn on the year's shortest day. That flash is a lesson, not just a decoration. It says, wait until this line of light hits this mark, then begin. If a serpent's body snakes down a stairway on an equinox afternoon as the shadow moves, the whole city learns to read the change of a season with their eyes, not with numbers. When a pillar line frames a major star's first rise after weeks of absence, chant and farming can keep time without a notebook. Examples stack with soft echoes rather than copies. An Ujjat eye stares from tomb walls, a mark of sight, guard, and wholeness. The same eye appears where the sun and moon fight, and the wound heals. In another range, a horned figure stands calm on Indus seals. The horns might be wild strength or moon curves or both. Across an ocean, a tree that joins worlds grows in a northern myth and holds a full sky in its limbs. On coasts where voyages knit islands, canoe cosmologies tell stories where the stars are lands and the boat is your life moving through them. None of these repeats a single picture, yet they rhyme in function. Look down at a workshop bench. A young stonecutter drags a chisel along limestone and tries to keep the curve clean and true. His grandfather pressed the same motion into his hands with slow patience. The curve means spring in this place. When the light hits that arc, a communal job begins: sowing, fishing, a march up to a pasture. He does not argue about archetypes. He sharpens his tool on a plaster block until the scrape becomes a single even note. The shape must carry on or the timing will slip. Once your eye finds the pairs, symbol plus event, the grammar tightens. A circle scratched anywhere can be a doodle. A circle that catches a beam on a fixed day becomes an instruction. A serpent worked into a stair railing might be playful. The same body using shade to climb the steps at equal lengths as the afternoon falls becomes a device. When art yields a measurable, repeatable signal, memory stops being fragile. The message no longer depends on someone's skill with dates. It depends on the sky, which keeps faith on a longer leash than men do. Skeptical notes still help. Some iconographic comparisons are stretched to fit. A spiral can be a snail shell with no calendar in mind. A horned figure can be a bull dancer or a king's title, not a star map. Cherry-picking shapes across epochs invites mirages. The safer ground lies where the symbol, the building, and the repeatable celestial cue stand together. That triangulation cuts down chance. It turns a pretty carving into a working line you can test every year. Notice also how the same form solves small local needs. On a desert plain, a circle of stones lifts a solar path out of the sand with barely any material. In a deep valley, a notch on a ridgeline cuts dawn into a signal that travels miles. In damp jungles, paint and shadow do the alignments from stair and rail because heavy towers rot and light must turn the page for you. The toolkit is the same, but the medium shifts with climate and habit. That suggests method rather than fashion. Some whisper that this grammar passed hand to hand along trade routes where obsidian and stories walk together. In that telling, a seed culture may have carried core motifs, and local groups grew them into their own gardens. Critics counter that human brains find the same solutions when faced with the same sky and the same seasons tugging on food supply. Both lines can breathe in the same room. Diffusion and convergence do not exclude each other. Rivers meet and keep their colours for miles before they blend. Let the pattern tilt in the light. The circle points to cycles you can trust. The serpent points to energy, flow and return. The boat moves you through a danger and sets rules about cargo you must not forget. The tree or pillar lift your eye and you're counting. Tie any of these to a solstice or a heliacal rise, the first dawn star after absence, and you get a grammar that says when to move, when to hold, when to mourn, when to plant. You can lose the words and still keep the moves. Odd facts keep the ear awake. A carved eye in one place doubles as a measure for malting vats. The same curve ensures the brew cycles match a feast day. In another, oars on a painted boat hide tally marks for a rainy season length. A serpent's scales are spaced to act like a ruler, 7 big, then 7 small, a rhythm you can drum out for counting days. When a motif earns 2 jobs, beauty and measure, it tends to endure because it feeds both heart and stomach. Walk again through the workshop. The apprentice sets the chisel down and brushes the dust with his wrist. He lines his knee against the block to keep the angle and takes a breath. The old curve lives under his hand. The light in the courtyard has a texture you only notice if you've waited for it before. Thin, precise, and cool. He does not know who first decided the curve looked like spring. He only knows that when the shadow lands on the last half turn, the seed jars open. Over time, the sentence length in stone grows. A site gathers symbols and stacks alignments so that one ring handles winter, another marks a star's season. A stair counts wet months with a moving snake, and a wall of boats points toward a valley where the river will forget its course every few years. These are not random decorations piled up. The overlaps are part of the design. If one cue gets clouded, another still fires. If a story drifts a little, a beam catches a spiral and pulls the tune back. Stand far back and the grammar speaks of cycles. Circles within circles, snakes that loop, boats that leave and return, trees that drop seed and rise again. Cycles are comfort and threat. They warn that the cold comes on schedule and so do storms with big teeth. They promise that light returns. They imply loss is not a glitch but part of the rules. When you teach a child with these shapes, you also teach them to expect to rebuild. That expectation is a form of strength. The small payoff clicks quietly. The code works across languages because it points beyond speech. A circle means what the sun does. A serpent means what a river does. A boat means what your ribs know when the wind rises. Stay upright. Keep your weight centered. Share the load. You can carry this grammar across borders and centuries without an interpreter, because the referent is not a dictionary but the sky and the ground. If the design runs on cycles, then amnesia and recall also keep time. Stories swell, thin, and swell again as need returns. Stone catches the beat when the words fade thin. There are seasons when the symbols mean theatre, and seasons when they save lives. The curve on the wall waits either way. A ritual becomes a festival becomes a story. The story keeps the tune and loses the key. You can hear the drift at the edges, like a melody handed from house to house, until a verse quietly changes shape. The meaning thins, not out of laziness, but out of long years and hard miles. People move, tools shift, the sky markers tilt by a hair, and the tale still walks on because it is easy to carry when your hands are full. Knowledge breaks in predictable ways. A shock tears a village. Survivors bundle what they can into memory because the clay tablets cracked and the scrolls burned. Migration rubs words smooth. A term for a device turns into a word for a blessing. Children speak the new tongue of a port city and lose a syllable that once pointed to a river crossing. Specialization splits the old whole into parts. The stargazer becomes a guild, and the farmer becomes another. The link between the star and the furrow weakens when they stop sleeping under the same roof. You can watch the loss in small acts. A new generation takes up a rite because it feels good to gather. The drumbeat stays, the timing shifts by a little. The reason for the timing fades from sight. A certain refrain once told sailors when to leave harbour before the river reversed. It turns into a chorus that everyone loves to sing at the end. Function becomes mood. Memory keeps the warmth and lets the instructions slip. Some groups fight the slide with craft. In parts of West Africa, griots carry whole trees of lineage in their mouths. Names stack, marriages branch. Births and deaths lock into place with proverbs as nails. The recitation is not just pride, it is a legal record wrapped in rhythm so it can travel clean from ear to ear. On Pacific seas, navigators rid swells, bird paths, and star roads without metal. They hold the map in chants that trace islands like stepping stones. In Australia, songlines stitch country to melody. A verse tells you where water hides, which ridge breaks the wind, where a path cuts across a salt pan. These are not quaint habits. They are field manuals you can hum. Still, memory drifts. Without a fixed check, error multiplies and hides as confidence. A star's rising point creeps a little each lifetime. The song does not mention the creep. A boat leaves a day too late, then two. The net comes up thin, and the reason no longer fits any word the crew shares. A measuring stick once carved into a festival step wears down under thousands of heels. A priest taps the carved notch out of duty, not out of understanding why that notch sits there. Let the pattern tilt in the light. Precision in oral form depends on rehearsal, public correction, and anchors that do not move. If the world shakes those anchors loose, the best memory still needs a lighthouse. That is why people tie stories to the sky, or to stones that do what the sky does. A shaft of light that finds a mark on one morning each winter does not care about a lost verse. It lands anyway. A shadow that crosses a carved spiral at noon on a certain day will teach you, even if the lines between the gods have burned to ember. Walk into a courtyard just before dawn. A grandmother sets down a woven basket and claps once. Her voice slides into a planting song she's known since she was young. The first note lands in the chest like a bell. The children sway and laugh. Midway through, she frowns at the second verse, pauses, and shakes her head. She hums through the lost words and brings the tune back with a firm nod. The garden does not notice, but the verse that carried a rule about when to turn the soil has slipped. Only the heartbeat of the chant stays. Others dismiss the worry and say that if the song feeds the heart, the crops will follow. Critics counter that feeling full is not the same as remembering what the second verse once told you about frost on the last moon of the season. There is tenderness in both views. The elder keeps the shape because it keeps people together. The skeptic worries because a single mistimed week can erase a pantry. Both are right, and neither stops the slow fade when a community loses the tools to check itself. You can see how fixes appear. People mark a doorway so the first light after the longest night lines up with a notch. They set a bowl in a shrine so a drop of water forms only when the air cools past a certain point. They carve a line that a shadow will trace only when the sun sits at a precise height. These are simple devices that backstop the song. If the verse bends, the light will tug it straight next winter. If the verse is lost, the beam becomes the verse. There is a quiet craft in how long-lived groups design for error. The durable parts sit outside the head. The repeatable parts live in public. The check is not an argument but a sunrise. A child can see if the light misses the mark by the width of a palm. No one has to win a debate. The stone speaks in the same way every year. It tells the hour to begin the field work. It tells when to move livestock before the rivers eat the banks. It offers a correction without humiliation. A festival grows around such checks because people need joy at the hinge of seasons. The trouble arrives when joy becomes the only engine. When the bread and songs alone define the day, the quiet work underneath starts to wobble. The calendar turns into fireworks. The position of the beam on the wall becomes a selfie spot rather than a time signal. The cut between the two uses can be thin. Once the line is crossed, it takes someone stubborn to pull the purpose back into the frame. The record of written words makes a new kind of stillness. When writing appears in a community, it does not erase the tales, it freezes them. Myths that once flowed become fixed, pressed into clay or cut into stone. A verse that could adjust to a new shoreline now sits like a photograph of something that moved for centuries. You gain memory that does not tire. You lose some of the drift that kept a story alive to changing wind. A blessing and a bind in the same stroke. Now weigh the long arc. Oral memory can carry complex data for thousands of years when it ties itself to actions you repeat. It can map reefs, name winds, count kin, and keep law. It can warn against building too close to a mouth of a river. But without regular touchpoints, stars, shadows, tides, the tune will wander. The next village will carry a version with its own slight bend, and the bend will pass down as if it were always straight. Some whisper that the most durable civilizations were less about big cities, and more about dependable latches between story and sky. In that view, a temple is a machine for fixing myths to the year. A rite is an update cycle. A festival is a service window for the code that runs planting, marriage, travel and repair. It is not piety alone. It is maintenance of shared memory with song as the interface and stone as the hard drive. That does not remove the human ache. A mother burns a handful of wheat and thanks a god because her mother did. She cannot read the marks on the lintel. She does not know why the notch sits where it does. She watches the fire and hopes for steady rain. In that small act, both loss and continuity sit together at the same table. The rite holds her and her neighbours close enough to survive mistaken chance. If forgetting follows lines we can predict, then the old builders likely planned for it. They set light traps and shadow calendars. They stored ratios in proportions your hands could build without numbers. They layered meaning so that if a word broke, a shape could keep teaching. A spiral, a pole, a pool, a cup in stone, the firmware of a culture waiting for the next set of users. Even the games of a festival, the routes of a procession, the order of torches after dark all can carry instruction without a single sentence. Think of the checksum. In a file, a checksum verifies that the message arrived whole. In a culture, myth plus monument might do the same. The story carries warmth and reason. The stone supplies the correction when breath alone starts to wander. If the two agree in a spring, the fields fill. If they disagree, a careful mind goes searching for where the drift began. The fix can be gentle. Add back a verse, adjust the starting drum beat, repaint the notch. The most sobering feature of the drift is how graceful it looks while it happens. The dances stay beautiful, the feast tastes good, the young laugh and fall in love at the edge of the square. The missing piece is small and quiet. It rarely shouts. Someone notices years later and calls it nostalgia. Someone else calls it progress. Meanwhile, The star keeps moving along its long circle. The beam on the wall shifts a finger's width south. Maybe that is why many cultures built redundancy, a calendar in the doorway, a chant in the mouth, a route in the feet. You do not need them all each year. You need one to audit another, then rotate the burden so no single channel grows brittle. If the sea takes the harbour stones, the chant still carries the date. If the chant forgets a note, the doorway catches the light. If a war burns the doorway, the root still finds the spring. The grandmother who lost her second verse is not the end of the chain. Her grandson plants on the day the light strikes the floor. He watches his shadow cover the old marks. He asks about the missing line and gets a shrug and a smile. Later he finds an old carving under a table and traces the groove. It fits the beam exactly. The room fills with a feeling that does not have a name. It sounds like a tune remembering itself. When you see loss in slow motion, the temptation is to mourn. There is room for that. There is also a quiet way to read it as design. A ritual turns into a festival, so the body will keep showing up. The festival turns into a story, so the heart will carry it away. The story keeps a beat that a child can tap on a window ledge. Then the sun walks in on schedule and lays a hand on the right stone, and the beat learns where to land again. The code for a society that can weather long winters is not a single vault or a single book. It is a braid. Breath and stone, dance and star, law and proverb, and the note that says, "Check me against the sky when you forget." If you hear that note under the music of the old places, the hair lifts on your arms, not from fear, but from recognition. If a tune and a wall can keep a field alive, what else in the old world might be a stored instruction wrapped in beauty, waiting for someone to read the proportions rather than the legend carved in the corner? A block the size of a bus sits in a terrace of weathered stone, its edge meeting the next with a seam you could hide a reed inside. The wind moves over the hill and slides past a row of tool marks like faint ribs. Down at the abandoned quarry, ledges step inwards where men once chased a seam and left wedges in old drill holes. The air tastes of dust even now, as if the day's cut just ended. The questions did not clock out. Across scattered sites, a few puzzles keep a stubborn weight. On a Lebanese ridge, 3 foundation stones weigh more than most cranes like to consider. Their faces sit flush, their backs locked into a platform older than later temples that borrowed the stage. In the Bolivian high plain, a set of broken terraces shows joins and interior channels that look more deliberate than wear. Along the Nile, cores and boreholes in granite and limestone carry spiral scratches and glassy walls. Each place has its own tone and its own weather, but the theme repeats: large, heavy, tidy. The first pass answer is sober and not unromantic. Given enough time, people with simple tools and clear goals can do exacting work. Copper saws charged with sand will eat through hard stone in a line if you feed them and keep the rhythm. A plumb bob and a straight edge will tell you if your courage is straight. Levers move more world than most cartoons admit. Ropes sing if they are overloaded. 100 bodies pulling in a beat can nudge a block into a cradle with only a whisper of margin. We have seen trials where teams cut, shaped and set with nothing more than patience, grit and clever rigs. Even so, some details pull the eye back. At the temple platform, the question is less about the cut and more about the logistics. How do you plan the lift? Where is the staging area that makes sense of the move? If you use ramps, do you bank earth, build stone stairways, or braid both with a mile of fill? If you choose sledges, how do you balance weight, friction, and the long roll over uneven ground? None of these erase the possible. They invite a plan with more steps than the tour usually has time to tell. By the lake country at altitude, where the air runs thin and the light burns hard, the broken blocks lie in piles that reveal their joins. Some fit with a fin that locks into a slot. Others show flat faces that mate like pages. People disagree on whether water channels and right angles prove anything beyond careful craft. It is fair to say that a skilled crew can make sharp corners and tidy recesses with hammerstones, abrasives and straight templates. Still, the volume of work remains stark. How many hands? How many seasons? What was the return that paid for that labour while Herd still needed watching? and barley still needed grinding. The old river valley offers another thread. Granite cores sit in cases now, their spiral grooves read like tree rings. The lines suggest a twist and a steady advance. With sand and copper tube, modern workers can pull a similar pattern from the stone. The speed is slower, but the principle matches. The argument slides from "can it be done?" to "how fast, how many, and why this finish?" That drift matters. It moves the conversation from miracles to schedules, from magic to metrics. It also leaves room for a thought that does not fight the evidence. The tools may be humble, but the planning may have been sharp. Critics counter the more breathless claims with measurements and checks. They go to the joints with calipers and find tolerances that are good, not divine. They call out photos that flatten perspective and make gaps look tighter than they are. They show how a light rub of plaster or mortar hides small sins and how a final polish erases tool chatter. That caution helps. It keeps us from chasing phantoms and lets the real feet stand on their own feet. It is one thing to doubt a legend. It is another to see the work and respect the hands who did it. The hands are always there if you know where to look. A palm-shaped hollow on a step tells you where 1,000 grips steadied the same climb. A shallow V where a rope bit a stone shows how a load turned a corner. In a roof trench, a smear of red ochre marks a line someone snapped to keep a course straight. And on a breezy day, a plumb line wobbles and settles, and a foreman watches the thread stop moving. He nods and taps the edge with a small hammer. A note rings back. The teamies is off. The edge kisses, and the long exhale you cannot hear in a book leaves a human chest. Supporters suggest another layer hums beneath the visible craft. They speak of resonance, of stones that like to store and pass sound when set in certain shapes. They point to compass needles that act odd near certain walls, to magnetic patches in bedrock, to lines in the landscape that line up with more than chance. They wonder if a survey once mapped energy the way we now map water and streets. Critics dismiss this as romance without body. They ask for repeatable tests, for clean controls, for instruments that do not lie. Both sides, at their best, agree on the need for better data and fewer promises. There's also the plain fact that materials remember. Limestone keeps a chisel's bite. Diorite shows where a harder stone worried it, stroke by stroke. Granite records heat as microcracks and sheen. Read closely, those surfaces tell you what touched them, and with what patience. A copper blade leaves a different scratch than a steel one. Sand under a saw leaves a field of tiny arc marks that a trained eye can pick out even under a polish. The stones talk if you let them, and most of what they say is not supernatural. It is human, slow and proud. Sometimes the outlier is not a tool mark, but a missing scar where you expect one. A terrace with no clear ramp trace. A platform with no spoil heaps that match the quarry volume. A trackway that ends before the heaviest loads. Absence is not proof, but it is a gap that calls for a map with roads that may have vanished under later work, or for transport methods that leave less mess. Sledges over wet clay, rollers reclaimed after the move, or routes now buried under later construction. Sometimes what's missing asks the louder question. If there was a method that eased the worst friction, it might not have looked like a machine. It could have been a sequence. Wet the roadbed to a certain shine. Lay a reed mat and then a skin. Time the pull for the cool hour when fibre ropes grip best. Stagger teams so no one line overheats. Teach the rule as a song so no one forgets when to breathe and when to set their heels. A method like that does not leave gear to find. It leaves a rhythm, a habit. A way of building that moves like memory from site to site and century to century. On the edge of the high plain, a mason still tests a fit with a single strip of light. He stands a stone on end and slides its partner across until the beam disappears. He listens for scrape and dullness. He licks his thumb and wipes a thin smear of grit away. He does not write a paper. He teaches the apprentice how a corner should feel under the nail. When the job ends, the tools sleep in a chest and the lesson walks home in a head. 1,000 years later, all you find is the corner that still meets right, Others dismiss the urge to fold these puzzles into a lost-mastered science. They remind us that a strong back and a keen eye still build bridges and cathedrals with hand tools today. They say the awe you feel at a clean joint is real, but it does not demand a ghost. You can hold that truth and still keep a door open for questions about planning, surveying, and how knowledge flows across generations. One does not cancel the other. If anything, respect for the craft should make us want better explanations, not easier myths. There is room for small testable edges. Clay balls under heavy sleds cut friction a little. Water in front of a sledge keeps sand from piling into a ridge. Thin pads of wood let a block pivot in place and seat into a key. Levers with small pivot stones under the foot add a sneaky gain. None are magic. All add up in a real workday until the load moves and the site grows. The big stones we point at today could be the sum of these small tricks, tuned hard by people with nothing but time and outcomes to track. The outliers may be less about what hands can do and more about what minds can remember. A culture can lose a machine and still keep a method if the method is stored in training, ritual and proportion. You do not need to carry the tool itself across a fallow age if you can carry the blueprint in your body and your song. That idea rests quietly and does not fight the evidence. It just asks us to look at the old work as the tip of a long, invisible line of teaching. Walk back to the terrace where the big block meets the next. The seam looks quiet. The hill keeps its own weather. The quarry is only a broken shelf and a few cut marks. What remains is a set of choices made by people who wanted stone to behave, and found ways to persuade it. In the debate around their methods, the best gift the puzzles give is not an answer you can frame on a wall. It is a sharper set of questions and a steadier pace for asking them. If planning lived longer than gear, then numbers and ratios might be the archive we have been stepping over, the part of the blueprint that survived the road. Shafts of winter light slide across a chamber wall and pause on a faint set of carved lines. They aren't pictures, no birds, no kings, just ratios scratched into stone, a simple stack of measures shown by length and angle. The light advances and those marks line up with edges in the room. A diagonal that meets a corner, a curve that resolves into a doorway. You hear the low air move. Dust hangs like a fine net. The sun keeps time across the floor while the geometry wakes. Across the world, sacred places keep showing the same shapes. Builders raise platforms that slope at the same angles. They set doorways where a diagonal lands, not where space might be easier. The blueprints seem to rhyme across oceans and eras. That is the discovery that keeps tugging at patient eyes. The same proportions repeat in Egypt, in the high valleys of the Andes, in the basin of Mexico, and in old stone rings beneath soft northern skies. The measures recur as if the math travelled better than the people did. Here lies the puzzle. How do cultures that never traded letters or shared a king end up using near-identical geometric plans when they shape their holiest ground? Lines meet in the same ratios. Heights echo bases. Angles resolve to the same pleasing slopes. You can call it convergent design. Many minds, one sky, one gravity. Or you can leave a little space for the quieter thought that number itself may be the courier. Critics counter that we select the matches we like and ignore what doesn't fit. The doubt has teeth. The pattern remains. Take a familiar ridge of stone on the Nile floodplain. Measurements taken from its base to its peak resolve to a ratio many now call golden. Other readings trace a link to the circle's constant when you compare perimeter to height. The structure also sits with a near-perfect face toward the four cardinal directions, tipping only a fraction of a degree from true north. This isn't a rumour you can wave away with a laugh. It suggests careful sighting, steady tools, and a plan rooted in simple, repeatable truths. On the high plateau of central Mexico, a city spreads in rectangles and diagonals that click into square root of two symmetry, that neat relationship of the square and its diagonal. A long avenue lines to a point on the horizon. Buildings step the same way, like chords in a scale. In the Maya lowlands, temple bases and heights carry matching proportions that rhyme with those far older stones in Egypt. Not a carbon copy, a shared grammar. Supporters suggest the choice of ratios helped lock the buildings to the sky's motion and to human gait, producing forms that felt right in the body as well as in the eye. Now fold maps together. Take a plan of a stone ring from a windy plain and scale it to meet the footprint of a jungle complex. Slide in the baselines of a desert pyramid field. Edges snap closer than chance ought to allow. The centre points speak to one another with quiet certainty when laid in the same frame. Others dismiss this as a parlour trick. With enough scaling you can make almost anything kiss. Yet when the touch points include gates, altars, and sight lines that track the sun's turn, the coincidence turns harder to shrug off. We step away from the bird's eye and move to a single set of hands. It is 2600 BCE. A mason knots a rope, pushes a peg into packed ground, and walks a circle with steady steps. He draws a second loop, smaller by a taut handspan, a third at a precise fraction again. He doesn't speak of pi or square root of 2. He whispers lengths his father gave him and his father before him. The rope creaks. Chalk leaves a soft arc. Geometry travels in muscle and habit even when numbers have no names on paper. The strength of math is its calm. It doesn't care which language you sing in or which god you pray to. A ratio survives translation. It survives a burned library. You can lose a story and still keep a measure if it hides in a shape you teach with tools and ground. That is what some whisper about the oldest plans, that they rode out storms inside rope, peg and memory, then reappeared wherever people tried to bind stone to sky and calendar to seed. Hold your ear to the walls too. In a fortress of fitted blocks above an Andean city, a shout returns with a round, chest-heavy tone. In a burial chamber within an Egyptian pyramid, a hum rises and settles at a nearly identical frequency. That note is not a myth. It's an interaction between space and sound that repeats within two very different stones and cultures. Supporters suggest the builders tune these spaces on purpose, using resonance as a tool to mark a threshold for ritual, or to steady a chant by giving the voice a firm floor to stand on. Look more closely at the alignments. When a room faces the dawn a hair off true east, it may be leaning toward a solstice sunrise. When the length of a causeway meets the angle of a slope at a number that feels familiar from other sites, it might be a pointer to a calendar day or a star's turning. These are practical tricks. If your harvest depends on the sky behaving, you want a monument that will teach your grandchildren without a book. You want a line of light that proves the season changed, a sound that anchors a memory you can revisit each year. Skeptics raise a fair point. If you gather enough measurements from enough places, you will find ratios that match just by volume of data. That is why the specific pairings matter. When base to height, cardinal alignment, and sonic character all agree in one complex, and then another half a world away repeats that trio, the case strengthens. Each extra layer reduces the role of chance. The plan starts to look less like fashion and more like a toolbox built to endure and to teach. Think about math as a storage medium. Words drift, scripts die. Proportions travel well because they live in structure. A wall that meets a ceiling at a given angle not only looks right, it performs. It channels air. It handles weight. It carries a tone. Numbers make that possible even if no one writes the numbers down. This is why a rope and peg can carry a long memory. The body remembers how to pull a length, how to split a span into thirds by folding cord. It is a kind of lossless compression made from habit. In the desert plain far south of modern Cairo, an older circle of stones speaks to the sky with simplicity. Rough pillars stand, and gaps frame the rising of key lights in the year. This is geometry without polish, but no less careful. The same logic shows up later with deeper refinement in temples and causeways. The through line reads like a curriculum. Mark the sun, measure the shadow, set the ratios, then stack stones that keep the dates safe for the next 100 winters. Return to the high platform in Mexico. The city plan obeys a chord and diagonal rule. The big pyramid slopes keep to a rhythm that repeats in the steps of a cascade of smaller sites down the avenue. Processions move like a living protractor demonstration. The feet of dancers reinforce the measure year after year. Performance becomes a memory device. Between ceremony and brick, the math holds. Cross to the Andes again. Blocks meet with such accuracy that a knife would clink and stop. The shapes are irregular to the eye, but satisfy constraints the hand can feel. Surfaces lean into each other at subtle angles that distribute stress and tame the shake of the ground. It is a geometry of survival in an earthquake world. Critics counter that patience and practice can explain all of this without hinting at a deeper inheritance. They may be right in part. The lesson, either way, is that proportion is not decoration. It is a choice that keeps homes and hearts standing. A different layer appears when you listen during quiet hours in these spaces. In both the Andean wallscape and that Egyptian chamber, the same tone lives. Not a perfect match, but close enough to make a careful ear raise. That note may have been a threshold test, a way to know when you stood in the right place at the right time of year, or it may have been meant to shift how a crowd felt in their chests, so they would remember the turning of the season as a physical event. Either way, it is encoded physics. When you set a compass at these sites, the needle meets the plan as if both had been born together. The main axes line up within a hair. The small errors are consistent with the tools of the day and the drift of the world. The builders saw the sky and used it like a grid. Then they slipped in special numbers that keep appearing elsewhere. The golden cut, the squares diagonal, the circles constant unwound into straight edges you can lay with rope. Now overlay the plans again, a ring of stones set within an earthen bank, its gaps pointing to light. A rectangle of courtyards and waterworks linked by a ceremonial road. A trio of pyramids stepping a desert horizon. Scale and rotate and sightlines stack in pairs. Waterlines meet processional routes. Sightlines to winter-dawn match. It is not a total match, but anchor points keep landing on anchor points. This is less about clones and more about structure encoded with the same key. A young builder learns by tracing. He runs his fingers along a carved ratio on a lintel because the mark sits at his height. He copies the curve with a bit of wet clay and shows it to his aunt, who nods and says to pull the rope tighter next time. He will never write an equation. He will remember the pull and the sound the room made when the walls reached the right angle. Geometry becomes a family story he can pass on, even if a flood takes the village. The idea that numbers act as a universal encryption key will feel grand to some and thin to others. Yet watch what endures when empires fall. Names of kings fade, lists of wars blur. Proportion remains in stone, in how a wall leans, in how a beam rests. You can rebuild from that. You can open an old code with a rope, a peg, and a sky that still turns the same way. This isn't romance, it's a practical form of memory. What the stones suggest is that proportion outlived the houses of power that paid for it. The buildings, in their bones, teach an order of time and space. They offer a method you can relearn by doing, not only by reading. That makes geometry the most stubborn kind of law. It returns with the first child who ties a knot and draws a clean circle in dust. And yet numbers are quiet. They need a rhythm to live in. Festivals that cross the long plaza. Chants that lift the exact note. Torches carried along walls that meet light at a steady angle once each year. Proportion may be the code, but people are the battery. Someone had to breathe on these measures so they didn't go cold between winters. The math waits in the stone. The rhythm waits in a voice. A scrap of song rides the wind across a low bay. You hear a boatman in a narrow craft keep time with his oar, each stroke matched to a line his father taught him. He turns the bow around a tooth of rock at the chorus and eases into a calm channel on the verse. The map lives in the melody. The current answers to the rhythm. Not a single city, not a throne, just a memory path shaped by water, breath and habit. If you look for a capital, you miss it. If you listen for roots, you start to see the shape. Let the frame widen. The first civilization might not have been glass towers or a one-time leap. It may have been a discipline of keeping knowledge after a shock. Think of people strung along coasts and rivers, moving goods and stories the way bodies move heat. Constantly, quietly, with purpose when the cold sets in. There's no empire to topple. There's a mesh of recall held in rites carved in stone, taught in kitchens and on decks. A priest chants the measure of the year. A navigator marks a reef with a proverb. A mason carries a ratio in a knot of cord. The question gnaws at the edge. Can a network like that hold its shape without writing? Some whisper it can, if the bridges are travellers' stars and songs. A pathfinder leaves harbour at dusk, steering by a bright star that will rise where safe water waits. A pilgrim carries a short staff not for show but as a ruler to check a temple's shadow at solstice. A farmer brings seed to a festival where the chant sets the sowing day, and the chant is the same in 3 valleys that trade. The traffic is the copy. Each journey refreshes a line in the code. We know trade can move ideas faster than kings. Obsidian trails shine through archaeology like dark rivers, sharp glass carried far from the mountain where it cooled, passing through hands that barter numbers and news along with blades. Coastal hopping stitches, islands with salt and gossip. River corridors with their easy drift and steady banks behave like memory lanes. Goods go one way, songs and methods move both. If you've walked a route twice, you become a link. If you can sing it, you become a bridge. A child sits at the bow and learns a lullaby that's not quite a lullaby. The first verse names a point of land with a nickname. The second names a shoal that catches the careless. The third fixes a bearing by the moon's height over a low hill at autumn. He hums it without looking up, but his eyes flick to the horizon at the right places. Years later, he will teach the same lines and add one more for a sandbar that shifted after a storm. The song updates. The form holds. Supporters suggest that geometry served as lossless compression inside this mesh. Ratios behave better than alphabets when the boat sinks and a people flee. A loop of rope and a peg in the ground can net a square whose diagonal carries a stable number you don't need to say out loud. The same circle, doubled and cut, gives you a triangle that repeats in temples across seas. If your script fails to travel, your number survives in stone and in a body's reach, arm span, foot, the length of a stride at dusk. You can teach a proportion by building it. You can check it with a shadow. This way of thinking turns stones into servers. A circle of menhirs angles toward midwinter sunrise, not as theatre, but as a repeatable event that anyone can verify without a priest. Such architecture stores a moment in the sky and makes it retrievable on schedule. Ritual becomes the software, a solstice gathering that resets calendars, a procession that trains children where to stand to see the light fall. Priests, then, act like hard drives, redundant, fallible, but repairable through use. If one memory keeper fails, the crowd still knows the chorus. Others dismiss this as romantic diffusionism, a wish to find one gentle net where local genius explains more. They point out how often communities solve similar problems in similar ways without borrowing, and how dangerous it is to read a shared symbol as shared origin. The caution lands. The map of the past is littered with tangled lines we mistake for silk. Still, the echo of recovery patterns feels odd to ignore. Flood, hunger, counting, law, planting, and stone. The order reappears where the coastlines differ, which hints less at a single teacher and more at a common syllabus designed to restore function fast. Consider how pilgrimage routes behave. Over time, people move along them not just for belief, but for trade and calibration. A high shrine draws coastal families inland at a set point in the year. They swap salt for barley and stories for tools. They stand in a chamber when a beam lands on a mark and call the day by name. Then they leave with a refreshed clock and a rumour of a new tool that shapes wood cleaner than the old. The next harbour hums with the new cut. The season turns on time. The net tightens, not by decree but by repetition. A mason in a dry valley ties a rope to a peg, walks a circle, and lifts a stone when the line touches a mark that matches what he was taught. He doesn't own the numbers, but he carries them well. He knows the ratio that opens a roof without letting it fall, and the rhythm that lets a wall sing softly when a voice meets it. He learned by doing, not reciting, so even if he moves across a range to marry or trade, he recreates the same stable shapes. He is a migrating file that writes itself onto new ground. If the sky serves as the master clock, the network can resync after shock. A fire takes a village's storage of grain and scrolls. The field stones remain. The day after the smoke clears, people can still stand in a certain place at dawn and watch a marker line up with the sun. That match sets the count. The count sets the planting. The ritual returns the rhythm. The notes lost to Ashhurt, but the bones of time and shape stand back up. It's not invincible, it's resilient. There are limits. Memory drifts without cross-check. Songs gain a flourish and drop a useful step. A priest with a taste for status adds a flourish that makes the math less clear and more grand. A harbour choked with silt diverts traffic, and a route forgets the verse that named a reef. Critics counter that such drift slowly dissolves the very pattern we're trying to trace. True. But the network resists drift by tying many lines to the sky and to the body. A ratio returns wherever two hands and a rope meet a flat patch of earth. A solstice sunrise checks itself. In this frame, a library looks like a chain of monuments, dances, sound chambers, and standards built into daily work. The knowledge is not locked behind gates. It's braided into feeding and sailing, blessing and building. Damage one thread and the braid holds. Damage many and it thins, then hardens again where survivors cluster. You don't need to believe a myth to use its calendar. You don't need to read a glyph to measure a course with the moon over a hill. Look at how ideas ride the edges of markets. A new way to chip stone spreads faster along barter paths than through royal houses. A better rig for a sail comes from a fisherman's tweak adopted by his neighbour, not from a decree. The strength of a network of recall is that it tolerates rough hands. It does not ask for permission. It rewards what works by letting it be heard again next season. There's a quiet beauty in redundancy. 3 shrines track the same star. 2 fail across a generation. One keeps the angle and draws travellers from farther away. The lost ones still teach, though, because their stones pull stories to them. A passerby asks why a spiral was cut where no light falls now. An elder tells how a different light once did, in a colder age. The tale carries risk and timing, and the humility to move camp when the river shifts. That humility may be the core of the culture we're tracing. Pride broken down into practice. You can feel the global echo when unrelated coasts rebuild after storms. Fishing returns first in both places, then counting days to tide, then ploughing or terrace work, then a marker to fix a season so food doesn't fail twice in a row, then a code of conduct to stop fights over water from tearing the ground apart. The same steps recur because the body demands them, and a certain kind of story makes them easier to recall under pressure. The mesh is not mystical. It is practical memory that learned how to sing. For a moment, put your ear back to the bay. The boatman's voice is steady. He nods to a child and shortens a phrase to show where the channel has narrowed since last year. The tune flexes. The channel changes. The method stays. In that small act sits the thesis. Survival rides on pattern more than on script. Numbers and stars anchor the pattern. Speech carries it around corners. Stone keeps it from tearing in two. Of course, local sparklight's much of history. Innovation blooms in many soils, and not every match across maps means one teacher. We can hold that and still note the odd fit of cycles, the quick return to the same set of tools, the shared grammar of proportion, light and law. The network idea does not erase local craft. It explains why certain shapes and rhythms reappear where travel was likely, and memory needed a durable form. Drift your mind to a muddy ford where a caravan waits. A trader hums a tune she learned at a shrine beyond 3 mountain passes. The man at her side recognises the cadence, not the words, and smiles. He adjusts his pack and joins on the chorus. They cross at the lowest stones. 2 strangers, 1 map. No parchment needed. If you wanted to build a system that endures when kings fall, you could do worse than this. Where climate resets the board, the pattern snaps back like a taut line. Food first, time next. Law to keep the peace, stone to hold the count, song to teach the stone to those who can't read it yet, then ships and seeds and long roads that shuffle ideas fast. In that shuffle, old notes return without their original names. They still work. That function might be the real ancestry that myths preserve. If myths are memory, then mythology works like a long-running data protocol. It sets a header, origin tale, flood, teacher. It defines a payload, how to count, when to plant, where to meet. It includes checks, light on stone, star at dawn, a note that hits right in a chamber tune for it. It routes by rivers, by trade winds, by festivals. It handles errors by redundancy. And when the signal weakens, it raises a pilgrimage and refreshes the file. There's a feeling that the mesh hums still, thin but present, in lullabies and cornerstones and the way some towns keep watch for a star without knowing why. The boatman lifts his oar and lets the current carry him a length, listening to the water's soft talk against the hull. Ahead, a headland waits for its verse. Behind, the night will hold the last echo of the map as we turn toward the clock in the sky that people once trusted more than kings. The air is cold enough to sting your teeth. A priest steps barefoot across damp stone and lifts a torch. The flame leans and sputters. Resin pops. He lays his palm against a carved edge and nudges a wedge, a breath's width, until the faint glow of the morning star threads the gap and touches a chalk line on the floor. He doesn't own the math for this. He owns the habit. The nightbirds retreat to the trees, and the temple holds its breath as the star slides away. He moves along the wall, fingers tracing pecked marks that his teacher traced before him. There is soot trapped in the grooves, and the stone gives back a little grit to his skin. He drags a taut cord from corner to corner and checks the angle where the eastern horizon lifts. He hasn't named the slow wobble in the sky, but he knows when the marks go soft. So he fixes them. 1 degree over a human life can ruin a calendar. A priest can fix a degree with a thumb and a string. Calendars everywhere carry this same pulse. Different tongues, different gods, same frame. Time isn't a road that runs straight, it circles. In India, ages stack like nested bowls. In Mesoamerica, counts click forward in long gears that reset by design. Egypt remembers a first time and then echoes. Greece sings the rise and fall of metals as if morality wears masks and changes with the season. The names don't match, but the feeling does. Creation comes in a wave, grows bright, and then the world steps down and begins again. The ending isn't a full stop, it's a return point. There is a hard edge in these endings. Flood, fire, a rain of bright stones, list of stars turning wrong. The tales rarely say, maybe. They roll out very specific weather. Water climbs hills it shouldn't. Ash blocks the noon for days. The sky shakes like a loosened drum. If you read these endings as theatre, they teach humility. If you read them as timestamps, they hint that people kept notes on resets, and those notes needed drama to live. Far above the temple lintel, the sky carries its own metronome. The Earth's axis leans and circles slowly. Over a long arc, the backdrop of constellations slides. 1 full turn takes a span so large it can swallow empires. You can't see this in a night. You can hold it in a line of stones that your children will adjust. If a culture tracks the dawn star where it rises each year against the same notch, the drift shows up. Not in a lifetime, but in a lineage. The line moves. The cord tightens. the mark shifts. That is how you count the long cycle without writing a number. Some temples face the solstice sun with such care that a finger of light lands on a small mark only once each year. Others match equinox dawn, even when the horizon is jagged. A few seem tuned to slower marks, setting sightlines on stars that do not keep still over centuries. Supporters suggest this was not accident or weather worship, it was calibration. A calendar tied to the sky can be repaired by observation. A myth tied to a calendar can be kept honest by light. Follow the man in bronze bracelets as he climbs the stair to the roof. The sky greys toward morning, and a wind brings the smell of rain from far water. He plants a tripod and sights along an arm toward a notch cut in the parapet. He waits for a known star to take that notch and then scratches a mark on a wax tablet. He cannot tell you why the notch has drifted since his father's time. He does not need to. He writes what he sees and moves the marker a thumb's width. The temple learns the sky this way, one patient correction at a time. Out in the rocks and the ice, other clocks tick. The planet's field sometimes falters and wanders, and the records of that are buried in cooled lava like rings in a tree. Ice lets go of its weight in pulses. Seas answer by stepping up shorelines in a season where once they would have crept. Volcanoes choose years they prefer. When you line up the long tales about endings with the long records in stone and ice, a rough cadence appears. Around spans of a dozen millennia, nature throws heavier dice. It is not exact, it is suggestive, like a drum you hear through a wall. Those dates whisper into human rooms. Cities don't only fall from wars, supply lines break when the weather sets its jaw. Around the Eastern Sea, palaces burn within a lifetime, and writing thins into simpler hands. Far later, a knowledge centre by the water loses its shelves to fire and decree, and 1,000 small lessons disappear into smoke. The scale changes, but the rhythm feels familiar. Skill flowers, then scatters. It gathers again in new hands, sometimes with a different name and a quieter voice. Walk the ancient corridors that still hold the sun in a particular way. A passage aligned so that winter light threads it like a needle. A distant stone circle watches a summer sunrise skim a marker and spill into a chamber that holds carvings of spirals and lines. A desert site marks where certain stars used to rise before the horizon lost them to dust. These are not just pretty tricks with light. They are durable ways to reset a community's sense of time. You gather, you watch, you note whether the shaft misses the mark by an inch. If it does, you teach your nephew how to move the stone a little. Others dismiss the grand reading. They say ritual creates bonds and needs impressive sun tricks. They say people built calendars to know when to plant and when to meet, and any cosmic language we hear now is our own echo. That caution keeps the feet on the ground. Still, when many places turn their faces toward events you cannot see without patience, and then maintain those sightlines for generations, a second layer peeks out. Not prophecy, maintenance of memory. The priest blows out the torch and leaves the wedge in place. He will come back next season to check it. He can't explain precession. He can show his son the scratch where the light should land. That is enough to pull a long rope of time through small hands. Time this long needs many small hands. It cannot live in one mind. It lives in adjustments. The longer frame changes how the old cycles feel. If a count measures not just harvests but grand turns in the sky, an end means that the code should expect rough seas. Tales of floods and falling fire become not threats but advisories. They fold fear into a pattern that people can face. We've been here. We carved a channel for the water to leave. We stacked grain on a higher shelf. We learned a song that tells you when the good stars return. The pattern hides in little places. An altar has 2 grooves that only line up when a certain constellation sits at a certain angle, and that alignment returns only once in a long while. A wall carries a row of niches that count years, and every few niches are set deeper, as if to mark a larger tick. A pillar holds numbers as ratios, simple, easy to remember, and those ratios echo across oceans. as if geometry was the shared lantern in a storm. One more human moment. The astronomer leans close to a student and guides her hand along the cord. He says little. He touches the notch where the star will sit in 20 winters if the cord stays true. He is teaching a future he will not see by making her fingers learn it now. This is how a long cycle gets stored in muscle, not just mouth. When paper rots or the city fails, a hand still knows where to pull. Supporters suggest that these cycles in stone and story reflect not guesswork but lived returns. People noticed that disasters cluster, that ages end with a flavour. They put a name to each age and gave it a mood because mood is what a child will carry. Critics counter that pattern hunting is our ancient bias, that we draw lines through noise and give it meaning because we are meaning animals. That is fair. Yet a bias does not mean the star never hits the notch. It means we should check with the cord. The long count from horizon drift turns in the mind. You can hear it when a community refurbishes a shrine to the same star after a generation of neglect. You can see it when a procession's path bends by a degree and nobody complains because the old men remember a word: adjust. The word becomes a virtue. The temple is a ruler laid against the sky. The people are the pencil marks that keep it honest. When you pull back across time, collapses start to look less like endings and more like breath. In, out. Fields go to grass. Grass returns to fields. A library burns, and a traveller carries a single book to a dull inland town where it seeds a school. A harbour chokes, and boats go to a new river mouth and learn a new tide. The myths in this light are not only warnings, they are lullabies for adults who know fear. They say, when the wave comes, climb. When the dark hangs, count. When the sky clears, plant. The priest's torch smoke thins against pale blue. He kneels and settles a small stone under the wedge, just enough to lock the angle until the morning star sits right again in the season, when the herons return. His work is simple, its target is not. He will be gone before the stone requires moving again, and yet his hand is already inside that future. That is the odd gift these cycles offer, a job that reaches past your life in a way that is still worth doing today. Now the view tilts forward. The same stars slide across the same roof lines in our cities, though neon colours them. Radio dishes take the dawn watch from old towers. Modern eyes chart the wobble with instruments and long plots that live on screens rather than in chalk lines on floors. Even so, the questions in the old stories touch the glass. What if the clock they watch still ticks? What else does it count besides years? The night sky has not changed its habits. Perhaps we are the ones who forgot how to read the longer hand. If myths are memory, then you're already walking through the archive. Streets named for saints, calendars marked in moons, a stone at the edge of town that catches one rare beam in winter. Each one a shelf. Not museum glass, but living stacks that breathe when people gather and retell. The old code hides in plain sight because it was built to travel light. A cresting wave in a lullaby, a ratio in a doorway, a warning tucked in a harvest rite. You don't need a library card to check it out, you only need to notice. So what will you carry forward when the grid flickers or the season shifts hard? Maybe a simple sign, the first star at dusk that tells you which wind is coming. Maybe a season, a count of nights between the last frost and the safe seed. Maybe a quiet habit of looking up and realigning your inner clock to the slow turn most people stopped seeing. Share where you're listening from and name the single story you would keep if the lights went dark. One tale that holds a tool, a path, a time. One tale you could hum while your hands work. The night is long, but the code is simple. Watch the sky, because it repeats with patience and keeps its promises without words. Hold the ratio, because a sound structure forgives small mistakes and teaches the next builder by feel. Keep the tale, because a lesson sung stays in a child's mouth longer than a rule carved on paper. If the world turns rough, these three are enough to bridge a gap. And if the world holds steady, they still tune the day, smoothing the edges of fear so the future can hear you coming.